CN Live, Episode 9. Watch our 4-hour special on the Cold War between the United States and Russia. We look at its complexities and ask, has the worst of the crisis passed?
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to Episode 9 of CN Live. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
On tonight's program, we devote the entire show to the ongoing crisis in U.S.-Russia relations. We will hear from a former head of the CIA Russia desk, a former retired CIA Russia analyst, an Australian diplomat who was posted to Moscow, a geopolitical analyst based in the Russian capital, a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer who served in the former Soviet Union, and a journalist who asks whether the worst of the new Cold War may be behind us. But first, the headlines.
In a London court today, a judge denied bail to imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange even before his lawyers had applied for it. District Judge Vanessa Baritza on Friday told Assange, who appeared by video link, "You have been produced today because your sentence of imprisonment is about to come to an end." She continued saying, quote, "When that happens, your remand status changes from a serving prisoner to a person facing extradition. In my view, I have substantial ground for believing if I release you, you will abscond again." WikiLeaks tweeted in response, stating that this morning's hearing was not a bail hearing, it was a technical hearing. Despite this, the magistrate preemptively refused bail before the defense requested it. Magistrate says Assange to remain in prison indefinitely. He has been in increasing forms of deprivation of liberty since his arrest 9 years ago, 1 week after he started publishing Cablegate. The Cablegate portion of U.S. charges amount to a life sentence, 50 out of 175 years. Assange's hearing on an extradition request from the United States is set for February 25th, 2020. He has been charged under the Espionage Act, the first journalist ever to be indicted for possessing and disseminating classified information.
In his memoirs to be released on Tuesday, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden writes that since 9/11, there has been, quote, "a litany of American destruction by way of American self-destruction, with the promulgation of secret policies, secret laws, secret courts, and secret wars. The greatest danger still lies ahead with the refinement of artificial intelligence capabilities," Snowden warns, "such as facial and pattern recognition. An AI-equipped surveillance camera would not be a mere recording device, but could be made into something closer to an automated police officer."
A U.S. intelligence report this week says that Russia's proposed nuclear-powered missile with unlimited range and the ability to evade anti-ballistic missiles will be functional in 2025. When President Vladimir Putin announced the new missile project last year, U.S. intelligence largely dismissed it as a bluff. The new weapon could render U.S. anti-missile systems in Europe useless, changing the balance of military power.
The Associated Press reports Ukraine's negotiating proposed peace talks with Russia, believes that Britain and France, who will mediate the talks, will sell out Ukraine, forcing it to accept conditions it does not want to accept. He said he fears Ukraine will be forced to allow separatist areas in the east to hold local elections. Eastern Ukraine rebelled against Kiev after the U.S.-backed coup that overthrew democratically elected President Viktor Yanukovych, whom they overwhelmingly had voted for. We begin our program tonight on Russia with an interview we conducted with George Beebe, a former head of the CIA's Russia desk. We're now joined by George Beebe. He's a former head of Russia analysis at the Central Intelligence Agency. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What were those years that you were running Russia analysis at the CIA?
I believe it was 2004 through 2008.
Well, that was a pretty important period in the changing of U.S.-Russian relations from the days of Clinton, of course.
It was indeed.
So George is the author of a new book called The Russia Trap, and we welcome him to CN Live. Thanks for joining us from Washington, D.C.
My pleasure.
This is Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. So, George, since you have been, you were in charge in that period, give us some idea what we would have to call a crisis in U.S.-Russian relations. When did this begin, and which side was more responsible, if you can if you can make that.
Well, I think the current level of animosity between the United States and Russia was a long time in forming. I wouldn't point to any one particular time where I would say, aha, this is when it happened. It was the gradual accretion of a lot of things that really began shortly after the Soviet Union broke up and we went into the post-Cold War period in the 1990s. But if I had to say where things really pivoted in Russia's perceptions of U.S. intentions, I think the breaking point was really in the 2003-2004 period, when a bunch of things happened that really persuaded the Kremlin and a lot of other people in Russia that the United States was really trying to undermine Russia, to surround it with hostile puppet regimes and ultimately break up the country. And when that kind of perception takes hold, it's very hard for the relationship to be fruitful.
Would you agree with this assessment that during the Yeltsin years, Wall Street pretty much had a run of the place in alliance with local oligarchs in Russia, and that they kind of asset stripped the country from the previously state-owned properties and impoverished the Russian people, and that it was, and I'm simplifying, of course, but it was on the back of this anger that Putin came to power, even though Yeltsin was the one who put him in initially, and that is why he's popular, that he's restored some sense of sovereignty and pride to Russia without being necessarily expansionist, as many critics of Russia say.
Well, I agree. I think that is the popular perception of Putin in Russia. I think the end of the 1990s was a period in which the Russians had suffered an unprecedented collapse. The gross national product declined by some 40%. This is sort of unprecedented in a modern industrialized state. Life expectancy for the average Russian male declined to about 57 years, quite shocking. And so there was, I think, a sense that Russia needed to restore order, to get back on its feet. When the state collapsed, the Soviet state, and really the Russian government during the 1990s was ineffectual, dysfunctional. There was nothing to take its place. In the United States, we don't need the federal government to do a lot of things. We look at the federal government as something that should be constrained, should be restricted to a narrow set of functions. And the U.S. people are generally pretty good at self-government without a lot of help from Washington. That's never been the case in Russian history. They've relied on a strong state, a strong central government. And when that went away, there wasn't much to take its place. You ended up with a lot of chaos in the 1990s, sort of a wild, wild west, anything goes environment. And people reacted to that. They wanted a return to normalcy, to order. And Putin's done that, and that's, I think, the basis for his popularity.
How much responsibility should the U.S. take, particularly the Clinton administration, for helping Yeltsin by interfering in the election, his second election, and by Wall Street? I remember people on Wall Street they were going over to Lithuania, especially the Baltics, but into Russia itself, and they were just making out like bandits. Should the U.S. be blamed, both Wall Street and Washington, for at least part of what went wrong in Russia?
Well, I think there's a lot of responsibility on a lot of parts in all of this. Certainly the U.S. Pursued policies with very good intentions that we thought would produce a democratic, free market, prosperous, thriving Russia that would be, as we phrased it at the time, at peace with itself and at peace with the world. We did not expect the outcomes that we got in the 1990s, just the opposite. So do we bear some responsibility for all this? Certainly we do. And certainly key players in Russia bear responsibility as well. There's a lot of blame to spread. What I don't think we're guilty of is bad intentions. I don't think that any players went into this cynically, looking to exploit the situation for selfish purposes. I think we expected that all of this would have a happy ending, not what we ended up getting.
That might be the view from Washington, but from Lower Manhattan, I think it is quite different. They are very much in the habit of exploiting people and profit being the main thing and not the impact on people's lives. Before I move this forward into Georgia and Ukraine, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Voss, my co-host, for any questions she has for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, George. I just wanted to ask you, your book, you talk about a shadow war that the United States has engaged in with Russia. And I was wondering to what extent in your book you discuss Russiagate. What aspects of it do you cover? Because obviously Russiagate is kind of a multifaceted scandal. You've got hacking claims, you've got collusion claims. What's your kind of definition of shadow war in your book?
Well, I use that term shadow war to refer to a broad range of activities that are going on between Russia and the United States today. Certainly a lot of it is taking place in the digital domain, cyber warfare, which includes things like cyber espionage, cyber influence activities, cyber sabotage of various kinds. There's obviously economic warfare going on as well. This is a tool that the United States tends to resort to very quickly. There's proxy warfare going on in places like Syria, Ukraine, and elsewhere. So all of these things collectively I refer to as shadow war. The common denominator in all of this is that I think both sides believe that they can contain the escalation so that means short of all-out direct kinetic warfare will stay below that level. So there's a lot of suspicion about the other side's intentions, a deep belief on both sides that the other side wants to destroy it, but a shared desire that this doesn't erupt into a real shooting war between the two sides, and confidence that it won't. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to say, look, we shouldn't have the confidence that we seem to have that we can contain the escalation of this shadow warfare that's going on. Now, as for Russiagate, I do deal with that in the book. It's not the focus. My approach to this is to say that there's little doubt that Russians were involved in some way in what Americans refer to as interference in the 2016 elections. What I question, however, is how much central direction were they under from the Kremlin, from the Russian central government authorities, and what the intentions were behind this. I have a lot of doubt about how much central direction there really was. That is, to what degree Putin sat down and said, okay, let's see what we can do to throw this election Trump's way and really try to divide and conquer the American political system and ultimately bring democracy down. I doubt that that's what went on. I can't rule that out. I think what the evidence that we have about this, there's not a lot of evidence that's come out publicly on this. I think we have to acknowledge that. But what we have seen is not inconsistent with that hypothesis. I can't disprove it. But from what I understand about how the Russian government operates and from what I have seen of the public evidence in all of this, I think there's reason to question that narrative and to wonder to what degree these were Russians that were acting without Putin's direct orders. And probably under some standing orders to go explore what information they could provide. And the intentions behind all of this may have been a combination of espionage. It's normal for countries to want to discover what might be happening in another country's political system in a pivotal presidential election, who the next leadership will be. But I think also part of this comes down to a belief in Russia that we've been doing this sort of thing to them for a long time. We've been playing a hands-on role in Russians' own politics. And there was probably a desire to say, look, if you're going to do this to us, you need to understand you're vulnerable to the same kinds of things. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, part of it may be just a feeling of, retribution. Part of it may be a desire to bring us to the negotiating table and to work out some sort of mutual ceasefire, which they have explicitly called for on a number of occasions. They said, look, we need to stop this interference in each other's internal politics. This should be out of bounds. We need to talk about this. And I suspect that one of the intentions that was behind all this was to say to us, look, the rules that you think you're immune to, you need to be subject to too.
So when you discuss, Russians that may have been acting, but potentially not under direct order from the Kremlin, I assume you're talking about Russian hacking allegations. Is that what you're referring to there? Okay, great.
Well, there's no question that there was a social media campaign that went on, advertising, trolling of various kinds. And there's no question that somebody penetrated the Democratic National Committee's email servers. Now, were those Russians? My guess is, yeah, probably. I haven't seen the kind of evidence that would show me without any doubt whatsoever that it was Russians, but I strongly suspect that that kind of evidence is out there. Now, what's not clear is why and who ordered this. The Washington Post reported that there was a human intelligence report that Putin himself ordered it. I'm very skeptical of single source allegations like that. You better have a great deal of confidence in the veracity of that source if you're going to base such a momentous judgment on a single source. And I'm naturally quite wary of doing that, and not being familiar with the source. As far as I can tell, somebody leaked this to the Washington Post. So you don't tend to leak information like that from a very sensitive source that you've got that kind of confidence in, because when you do leak something like that, guess what happens to your source? So that also makes me a little skeptical about this.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, the problem that I see with that is that there really is a preponderance of evidence to show that the Democratic National Committee was not actually hacked in the first place, much less by Russia. We only have information on that from CrowdStrike that's secondhand that the FBI did not see directly. They saw a redacted draft from CrowdStrike. There are a lot of different issues with that. So, but before I hand it back to Joe, I'd just like to ask, so, instead of maybe going down the rabbit hole of Russiagate, because I know we can debate the specifics of Russiagate for an entire interview, but I'd just like to return to your book for a moment and say, Russiagate aside for a moment, do you think that the escalation between Russia and the US is going to continue forward, and how dangerous do you think that is?
Well, I think yes, probably. I wouldn't have written the book if I were not genuinely alarmed by the situation that I see here. And the reason why I'm genuinely alarmed is I think the United States is suffering from a conceptual problem in its understanding of the dangers that we're facing. I think we have for several years now been convinced that Russia is a World War II kind of problem, that we're facing the equivalent of Nazi Germany. Not that the Putin regime, mimics in all aspects Hitler and the Nazi regime, but that like Nazi Germany, it's a fundamentally expansionist state. Like Nazi Germany, it regards efforts to compromise as signs of weakness that it can exploit. Like Nazi Germany, it will push as far and as fast as it can outward until it meets resistance. I think that's fundamentally our conceptual model here. And what we're scared of is not that we'll wind up in a nuclear war. What we're scared of right now is that we won't be tough enough or forceful enough to stand up to a revanchist Russia. That's our model. And what I'm worried about, what I argue in the book, is what we're actually facing is a World War I kind of problem, where the states of Europe back in 1914 wound up in a war that they didn't expect, that nobody wanted. It wasn't war by design. It was war by accident. It was a war that was the product of a whole bunch of factors that combined in ways that allowed a small trigger in Sarajevo to set off a giant catastrophe. And why I think this is a serious problem right now is I see that same sort of confluence of factors that are combining in ways that people aren't paying attention to create a situation where a small trigger could set off a real catastrophe. And I see the brakes on that kind of escalatory spiral disappearing. You know, we had put in place during the Cold War a whole range of rules and regulations, many of which were put in place after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after we each became really concerned that this could get out of hand. So we put in place arms control regimes and communications channels and formal and informal understandings about what was inbounds and what was out of bounds. Most of them are either dead or on life support right now. So I see the possibility of a bunch of things combining in ways we don't anticipate. And I see the brakes on that spiral going away. And that's an alarming picture.
So can we both agree, even if we disagree on some of the aspects of Russiagate we were talking about previously, that the coverage of the issue by somebody like, let's say, Rachel Maddow, who is basically, beating the war drums every night on MSNBC and has been for a long time, do you think that is dangerous?
Yes, I do. I think it's very dangerous. And I think it has contributed to a perception in the United States that Russia has become a deadly enemy, not just a competitor, but a country that is actually intent on the destruction of the United States. Not in the old Cold War sense of launching a nuclear attack on us, but in a more subversive, insidious sense where they're trying to use digital means short of actual kinetic warfare, to divide and conquer American society, to exploit and exacerbate these divisions and dysfunctions that I think we all recognize we're suffering from today. And that perception, I think, is paralleled in Russia by a perception that has been held for a much longer period of time, that the United States is a deadly enemy of Russia, that we're trying to surround Russia with hostile regimes and overthrow the Putin regime by subversive means as well. And that combination of deadly perceptions on both sides makes a potential crisis much more difficult to manage. It means we don't have the channels of communication that we need. It means trust is at rock bottom levels. We think the Russians lie to us. They think we lie to them. So how do you handle a crisis if it erupts? So these are real problems.
Let's look at the two perceptions for a moment. Before I ask you something about Russiagate again, right now there are 30,000 NATO troops, I believe, on the Russian border. There are not 30,000 Russian troops on the Canadian border. Victoria Nuland, who was Undersecretary of State for European Affairs, and John McCain, a leading member of the U.S. legislature, went to Maidan Square and gave out cookies and had speeches with leaders of people, very far-right leaders, and particularly McCain's case. We have a recording of Nuland speaking with the American ambassador at the time, Jeffrey Piot, saying, well, how are we going to midwife this thing to put a new leader in there? We didn't have a recording of a Russian foreign ministry official with the ambassador to Washington saying, how are we going to midwife the next American election? I mean, it appears to me, as a neutral observer here, as I tried to be, that Russia has far more to worry about from U.S. aggressive moves than Russia does than the United States does have from Russia, which is, in my view, just trying to defend itself from this.
Well, I think that's actually correct. When you look objectively at the situation, should Russia feel more vulnerable than the United States feels? I think yes. The United States, I think, is probably the most secure state, at least the most secure great power in world history. We've long benefited from the protection of two enormous oceans. We're not, for most of our history, vulnerable to external invasion. We're surrounded by relatively weak and friendly states to north and south. So we're not at all concerned about invasion from Canada or Mexico. We've long been a very united and coherent society at the grassroots level. And so, objectively speaking, we shouldn't feel very concerned. Now, that began to change, of course, with the advent of the nuclear age and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and suddenly we're vulnerable to things that we weren't vulnerable for most of our history. And it's changing again in the digital era, because with globalization, cyber technology, the interconnection of all of these things, suddenly we can be touched by things that we perceive as threatening in ways that we weren't able to be touched before. Now that, I think, is also combined with a sense of internal vulnerability that's largely homegrown. But the difficulties that we're going through politically and socially right now, I think, are being projected onto our perceptions of Russia. It's easier, I think, and perhaps psychologically more convenient for us to think that a lot of what we're suffering from originates in Moscow rather than originates at home. That's a danger.
That's a very good point. Now, just to continue my analogy from before, if the Russian foreign ministry's official in charge of North America showed up in Zuccotti Park during Occupy Wall Street era, while Russian troops were on Canadian border, I wonder how the U.S. would respond. So if we look at it in that way, we might be understand Russia's position. But if you can figure out that our problems are mostly our own making, as you're saying, and yet we're blaming external forces, which is the oldest trick in the book in terms of since civilization began, of course, to cover up your own problems, particularly when you have a ruling circle that wants to deflect from the issue, the problems they've helped create, social problems, and then there's a response. We saw the 2016 insurgencies for Sanders on the left and Trump on the right, and I think the response to that would be not to make the changes necessary to listen to the demands of your people, but to blame an external actor. It's, again, every major power has done this when they fight internal dissent. I think the same thing, as you've said now, is happening in the U.S. But if you could see that, don't other people in the agency see that, or in the rest of the foreign policy establishment see that? So aren't they cynically pushing this line rather than succumbing to some delusion or paranoia?
Well, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I will comment generally that my experience in government is been that most of the time people have sincerely held beliefs, and the differences that arise are not really differences between people who see the truth and openly, candidly acknowledge it, and people that see the truth and cynically try to ignore it or hide it. Usually there are differences between reasonable people who can reasonably look at the same set of facts and come to different conclusions. I suspect that that's what's going on in this case. I'll also say that empathy, that ability to walk around in somebody else's shoes and see things from that person's perspective, is a hard thing to do. It's hard to do that even with people that you know well. Now imagine trying to do it with a foreign culture, with a different history, a different set of beliefs and values and ways of doing things and interpreting things. It becomes very hard for foreigners to walk around in those foreigners' shoes and see things from their perspective. And we've had this problem repeatedly throughout our history, a lot of intelligence failures, wars, foreign policy mistakes. You can trace back to the difficulty in doing this. So I'm more inclined to blame this on legitimate differences in perception and belief than to cynical and selfish desire to ignore or suppress the truth.
That's interesting. I mean, it would seem to me that one of the key skills of a diplomat is, in fact, to put yourself in the nation that you are being sent to. I just want to turn again to the issue of digital warfare. First of all, the U.S., without question, I think, has the largest offensive cyber warfare capability in the world. They're certainly not the only ones. But second of all, I'm putting forward this position that some people get surprised at, and that is, I don't think it matters if Russia hacked the DNC, or whether it was leaked, as the Veterans Intelligence Professionals Society have, through their experiments, say that this was an internal leak and not an external hack from abroad because of data transfer speeds, etc. I'm saying even if Russia hacked it, it doesn't matter, and here's why. Because WikiLeaks set up an anonymous Dropbox. That means they will accept documents, and they don't want to know who the source is. So you have total anonymity. The Wall Street Journal and I believe CNN and others have copied WikiLeaks. They also have anonymous Dropboxes. So when you, as a journalist, receive a document, you don't know who gave it to you. It's left on your front door. In fact, that happened to Robert Perry, the founder of our site. He opened his door one day and there was a whole package of documents on in front of his door. He had no idea about related to Iran-Contra. He had no idea who put it there. But what did he do? What do? You look at the documents. If you can verify them as being absolutely accurate and genuine and newsworthy, you're going to publish that, whether that was the devil coming up from hell or not to give it to you, or whoever, because the documents are true. It's not like getting an oral statement when you're interviewing someone. You need to know their motives. You need to get another source or more because you don't have any real proof. You're just getting somebody's word for it. These are documents. So what did the documents show? The emails. It showed the truth. The truth was that there was corruption in the Democratic Party, that they tried to cheat Bernie Sanders, that there was a whole manner of fishy things going on at the Clinton Foundation. In other words, it doesn't matter whether it was Russia or anyone else who gave those documents because the information was true. Information voters needed to know. Had the information been disinformation, certainly that would be a serious matter where a foreign power would try to sabotage an election. But, our candidates do it to one another all the time, disinformation. That's what they do. But for a foreigner to do that would be a serious issue. But that's not what happened in this case. The information was accurate. So am I off base here? What do you think?
Well, I think you're right. I think the information that was provided to WikiLeaks is information that no one has disputed the veracity of. The Democrats have acknowledged the veracity of what was leaked. And so does it matter that it was Russia or anybody else that did it? Well, that doesn't have bearing on the veracity of information. You're absolutely right. I would also add that the dog that didn't bark here was a Russian disinformation campaign that it could have mounted had it really wanted to undermine Americans' faith in the legitimacy of the election. The Russians wouldn't have had to actually mess with the vote tallying to cause people to question whether the vote was actually legitimate or not. They could have used disinformation that suggested that they had done so. That would have caused an awful lot of doubt and really would have thrown the American political system into a tizzy. So one of the questions I have is that if Russia's motives were what a lot of people have alleged that they were, that they really wanted us to doubt our own political system, to doubt the legitimacy of our elections, why didn't they do those things?
Why didn't they?
Well, one hypothesis is that they realized that that would have been such an egregious action that we would certainly have retaliated in ways that would have hurt them. So they recognized that that was a no-go zone. Another possible explanation is that they really didn't have that intention. Their goal was not to undermine democracy, to undermine the integrity of our elections. Their goal was something short of that. And I acknowledge that both of those explanations are plausible given what we know. What disturbs me in our debate is that we haven't actually examined the alternative conclusion that maybe their intentions were aimed at some other objective. We've zeroed in on this conviction that they hate democracy, they want to undermine the American democratic system and ultimately undermine the United States itself, without enough attention to other explanations that I think are quite possible and probably even more likely.
Would you offer one of the two of those?
Well, I think the primary explanation that I would have for what was done was, ultimately they wanted us to know that we were vulnerable to the kinds of things that they think we've been doing there. Mm-hmm. And as a result, wanted us to talk seriously with them about rules of the game that would apply to us as well as to them, about what's in bounds and out of bounds, and trying to influence other people's internal politics.
There was a defensive position, and it ties into, in what ways do you think Russiagate ties into the geostrategic interests of the U.S. in regard to what we were talking about before, containing, as they see, Russia, or trying to, in fact, undermine and destabilize Putin's rule there?
Well, what we have is a situation, I think, where the rules of the game are not seen as clearly established. The United States has a very good sense of what it thinks the rules of the game should be. It also believes that as the world's leading power, as an exceptional nation, that there are occasions in which the rules shouldn't apply to us because we have higher purposes in mind. And so, we can do things like the Iraq operation or Kosovo operation, Libya, and we can do it without specific UN Security Council authorization because we know our motives are pure. We have the best interests of the world in mind. And if other states don't see that quite the same way, well, that's too bad, and we're not in a position where we're going to allow them to stand in the way of things that we think serve the greater good. The Russians say, hey, that's not a world order that we're going to buy into. And I think the Russians essentially have a different view. They want the world order to be run by a board of directors, so to speak, a group of great powers that talk together about how to handle these international issues.
That's called the United Nations Security Council.
Well,
that's what Roosevelt wanted.
To some degree, that's right. Yes. And they can mutually decide, how to handle these situations, how to apply the rules, and the Russians have a say in what those rules are, and the rules apply to the United States as well as the other great powers. I think that's Russia's vision. Now, they look at their neck of the woods, their immediate neighborhood as a sphere of privileged interests, as they call it. And they think this is completely normal. They think that great powers, by their nature, radiate influence out into their immediate neighborhoods. They dominate their immediate neighbors, just like they think the United States does in the Western Hemisphere. That's normal and natural, and that should apply to them as a great power as well.
George, you don't buy that American explanation that you gave a few seconds ago, that our motives are pure, so we don't need to follow international law. We can invade another country without Security Council authorization. You honestly don't buy that, do you? You think there's a real problem with that? That may be the crux of the problem, isn't it?
It is not an easy problem to grapple with, because the practical reality of the situation is that the world order is changing. In the post-Cold War period, the United States did not have a peer or even near-peer rival that came anywhere close to approaching U.S. power and influence militarily, economically, politically, socially. We were at the top of the pyramid by a long shot. That's not the case today. the rise of China has happened a lot faster than anybody anticipated, I think. And there's been a backlash against U.S. power, and people are starting to try to counterbalance what we're doing. So I think the practical reality here is whether the United States should or could continue to operate as if it didn't really have to take other great power interests into account. We're in a period right now where we have to. So we're going to have to find a way to establish some rules of the game that apply to us as well as others. And whether that should be the case or not, it doesn't really matter. It's a reality.
Elizabeth, if you'd like to carry on with some more questioning, please.
Sure. So do you feel that because we've talked about the Democratic National Committee, allegations that it was hacked. I was wondering if you had any perspective on the other aspect of Russiagate, and that is the allegations of collusion. To what extent do you think those have any basis in fact whatsoever? From the Steele dossier all the way through to Joseph Mifsud and the allegations that he is actually a Western intelligence asset rather than a Russian one. What do you think of that entire narrative?
Well, I think it's a narrative that many people in the United States have deeply wanted to be true for a long time, for a wide variety of reasons, some of which have to do with wanting to be able to blame internal American dysfunction on an external actor. A lot of it is the desire to want to correct what they perceive as a mistake that was made by American voters in 2016, and a lack of confidence in the wisdom of American voters to correct that mistake in 2020. So I think people have wanted to find a way to correct that mistake in advance of 2020. And frankly, I regard that as fundamentally anti-democratic. I think our system
we can agree on that.
Would work that way. Now, because there's been such a longing for this, and because, under the Mueller investigation, an enormous amount of time, resources, human capital, money was spent to try to find evidence of this collusion. And because they failed so clearly, I'm very skeptical that anything related to collusion actually went on. I think if there had been anything at all whatsoever to substantiate those allegations, it would have been found. And I simply don't see it.
That's very interesting to hear. I think people like Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow should pay attention to what you're saying there. Do you think that in itself, just that narrative, only that aspect of Russiagate, has had a dangerous effect, as in the terms of what you discuss in your book? Do you think that by itself, setting aside the hacking aspect, do you think that the collusion narrative has been, especially dangerous?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's had a profound impact on popular perceptions of Russia, which even before 2016 were quite bad. But they've reached extremely dangerous levels. It has hamstrung our government. It has made even basic diplomatic communication with the Russian government extremely difficult. And it's caused anybody that might want to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, we need to look at this a little more objectively, consider alternative approaches, keep open minds about some of this stuff. You're regarded as an apologist or an appeaser or, a useful idiot of the Kremlin, someone that's either consciously or unconsciously doing Putin's bidding. And that's a poisonous environment in which to operate. And it doesn't allow the United States to think very objectively about how to handle what I think we need to acknowledge is a dangerous state of relations between the United States and Russia right now.
I have one last question before I'm going to return the mic over to Joe, but I wanted to ask you, because, you and Joe were talking a moment ago about the possibility that Russia might want to, seed doubt in the American public about the integrity of U.S. elections. To what extent do you think the DNC and the Democratic Party is responsible for giving legitimate concerns on those grounds, not only by what was discussed and revealed in the WikiLeaks publications, the DNC emails and the Podesta emails, but also in the Democratic Party's defense of essentially rigging the primary process in 2016 in court regarding the DNC fraud lawsuit? They essentially said, well, we could have gone into a back room, smoked a cigar, and picked our candidate. And they also defended it on the grounds that it was protected by the First Amendment. So to what extent do you think it's legitimate for the American public to be concerned about election rigging, about the integrity of U.S. elections?
Well, I don't think anything that I've seen go on rises to the level of election rigging or manipulation of votes. What we have, I think, is a window into backroom politics, which reveals things that have long been going on in our political system that are, not pleasant to see, but not, quantum leaps beyond, the norm for democratic political systems. I won't defend the way the Democratic National Committee approached the nomination process in 2016, but I also don't think that it's an aberration within our political system. For a long time, we've had a lot of backroom politics, and in our history, the primary system that we have now has not been the norm. It's evolved over time. So certainly there was a time when people went into the back room and smoked cigars and decided who the nominee was going to be. That's not fundamentally anti-democratic.
Joe, back to you.
Yes, George, thank you so much for spending this much time with us. And I'm going to conclude now with a couple more questions. The real essence of the book is the possibility of conflict between the United States and Russia, which is unthinkable given the weaponry that it's a raid. Could put an end to life on Earth. So I want to ask you what specifically in great detail here, my question is going to be about what the U.S. can do to help avoid that and what Russia could do to avert that. Now, on the U.S. side, you said before that, and I think you're right, that there are U.S. officials who are sincere in their beliefs about U.S. purity and exceptionalism, and that they could be deluded, self-deluded, and act in a dangerous way. But in the media, too, where I work, I find that inexcusable. We have to be skeptical of everything officials say, and we should not just go along with that same mindset. But unfortunately, it permeates the media as well. There might be some sincere people, not just careerists, who think they're doing the right thing by supporting American foreign policy. So when we look at Georgia and Ukraine, which I know we could talk 2 hours on just that, but the perception that the media has given here through the government, U.S. government, is that these were two acts of aggression by Russia. But if you look at the details in Georgia, for example, the European Union did a study, or European Parliament, I believe, and they came to the conclusion that this was Georgia's fault. We can't go into all the details, but about their Russian peacekeepers were attacked. And in Ukraine, we have this evidence that the U.S. certainly backed the overthrow of a corrupt but democratically elected, constitutionally installed president, Yanukovych, and that the reaction to that was Russian help to defend particularly their port in Ukraine, in Crimea, and that they annexed Crimea as a reaction to what was a U.S. engineered or supported coup d'etat, when we know what we know about what Victoria Nuland said, and the money she said, $5 billion, have been spent over 10 years to promote democracy, etc. So how does the U.S. have to, first of all, do you agree with those quick thumbnail sketches I gave of Ukraine and Georgia, and what can the U.S. do here to change the perception of what's going on? And then what is Russia's role and their responsibility to help prevent war?
I'm glad you've raised this because it highlights this paradigm problem that I try to tackle in the book. Georgia, I think, is an excellent case in point. the United States viewed Georgia as a deterrence problem, as a World War II kind of problem. We thought that the Russians harbored aggressive intentions toward Georgia. So what did we do? Just like Winston Churchill would have counseled, you don't try to compromise with the aggressor state. You show that state that you're going to be resolute. You're going to stand up to them. If they're going to commit an act of aggression, that they're going to be in for a fight. So we accelerated the training and equipping of the Georgian military. We talked openly about bringing Georgia into NATO. In fact, the 2008 NATO meeting officially said that Ukraine and Georgia will one day be part of NATO. And then we issued explicit warnings to Moscow about not clashing with Georgia. And we thought all of this would cause the Kremlin to back down, that they would see that they were in for a fight, and they would say, okay, we don't want to go there. That's what deterrence theory tells you should happen. What happened instead? We wound up in an escalatory spiral that we weren't anticipating. Why? Well, American officials told then Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, don't get into a war with Russia. They're setting a trap for you. It will not go well. Don't do this. And we thought that he would say, okay, yeah, I get it. What did he hear? Well, people listen not only to the words that you use, they also listen to the signals that you send implicitly. And the signals that we sent implicitly to Georgia was, you matter. You are important to the United States of America. When the President of the United States talks to you, receives you, pays a lot of attention to you, that sends a message to you about how important you are. When the Secretary of State visits, when you get the kind of attention that Saakashvili in Georgia got, you can't help but think you matter. And when you matter like that, the conclusion I think that he reached was, yeah, I know they said don't get into a war, but they can't possibly leave me hanging here when all I'm doing is recovering territory that rightfully belongs to Georgia. So it was a very complex confluence of factors that led Georgia to strike the first blow. And the Russians certainly retaliated. Why? Well, part of the reason they did was because exactly the concerns that they had that Georgia was becoming a NATO member, that a hostile military alliance was spreading to Russia's southern borders in ways that had real security implications for Russia. So we wound up in a war that we tried to prevent, I think because we had the wrong paradigm for understanding the dynamics that were at work there. And I think, without going into a lot of detail, a similar problem resulted in the situation that we now find ourselves in Ukraine. Now, does Russia have responsibility for this too? Yes, absolutely. Both the United States and Russia have taken steps that contributed to this escalatory spiral. And both of them are going to have to do things to get ourselves out of it. Russia's certainly made some enormous mistakes here. They bear a lot of responsibility for what's happened in Georgia and what's happened in Ukraine. I think the decisions that they made in handling the post-Maidan uprising situation in Ukraine have made the situation a lot worse. I think they've made some real errors. So getting out of this is going to require both the United States and Moscow and Europe and the particular states that are involved here, all of us, to work our way out of this situation. It's not going to be an easy thing to do.
What would some of those errors be? For example, there is no evidence that the Russian army invaded Ukraine. There's evidence that they gave help in terms of intelligence, money, arms, perhaps, to people in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, and Crimea. The troops were already there. I mean, they were legally stationed there, and under the terms, they could leave base if the president of Ukraine gave them permission. Now, they still saw Yanukovych at that point as the president. He was the elected president. They didn't recognize the coup. I don't know. Have you ever heard that Yanukovych may have asked them to leave, or was it even necessary at that point? In other words, my point is they needed to defend that base in Crimea. And they were worried that that there was noises that Ukraine would become part of NATO as well. And we didn't even get into the whole expansion of NATO eastward, despite James Baker's promise to Gorbachev. That's a whole other thing we didn't even, which is crucial to this whole understanding. Maybe we should have talked about that. But what are the mistakes that Russia made in Ukraine that you mentioned?
Well, a lot of them, I think. Certainly Russia was a very hands-on player in internal Ukrainian politics. They were not a disinterested observer in all of this. I think there is evidence that Russian military were covertly involved on the ground in the Donbass. I think that by helping to encourage and supply the separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, Russia has got itself into a situation where they've actually ensured that there's a great deal of hostility and suspicion in other parts of Ukraine and in the Donbass itself toward Russia and its involvement there. To a great degree, they've created and exacerbated a situation that they've tried, I think, to avoid and that they feared. And that is, they've created an enemy to a great degree in Ukraine, exacerbated the forces in the far right there. I think that's a strategic error. I think we're in danger in Ukraine as a result of seeing a dividing line running north-south through Ukraine, which will become permanent and very dangerous in the same ways that Berlin and East and West Germany wound up divided during the Cold War. That's not going to be an easy thing to repair. So I think these are problems that partly are the result of what the EU, NATO, and the United States have done, and partly the results of things that Russia has done.
Now, Brzezinski, of course, wrote that Ukraine is the gateway, basically, to Eurasia, to controlling Eurasia. So if Russia sees it that way, and I believe they do, that they see this, as what China does, as a battle over the control of Eurasia. And since China and Russia are located in Eurasia and other major powers, they may seem to have an interest in maintaining their sovereignty there. And they see the West the U.S. in particular, trying to undermine and circle and destabilize Eurasia. Do you think that U.S. foreign policy now, particularly under Obama, but now under Trump, maybe it's harder to read, is following that Brzezinski model, and that Russia and China are simply acting in defense against that?
Well, I think I start from the premise that Ukraine is the most important country in the world to Russia. There's a long history there, politically, socially, religiously, economically, militarily. And we should have tread extremely carefully on this issue because of its emotional significance in Moscow and its practical significance as well. And we didn't treat it that way. We treated it like Russians shouldn't feel this way about Ukraine, that their emotions and practical interests there were illegitimate, and that therefore we shouldn't expect the kind of reactions that we got. The Russians warned us over a long period of time about what might happen if we actually tried to bring Ukraine into the Western orbit. And we didn't take those warnings as seriously as we should have. So your question about whether Russia sees itself as acting defensively there, I think there's no question that Russia sees itself as acting defensively there. Now, look, I think there's an intermixing of offensive and defensive objectives going on here. Russia's not simply playing defense, minding its own business and trying to defend itself against assault. It also sees itself as a great power. In fact, it believes it can't continue to exist in its present form unless it is a great power. So it's very difficult to disentangle offensive and defensive motives in all of this. Part of the reason why the states on Russia's periphery look to the West as a counterbalance to Russia is precisely because Russia makes clear that it thinks it ought to dominate these regions. So they seek help from the West. It's not like we're unilaterally trying to persuade them to move in directions they don't already have some inclination to move in. But as we do that, that in turn exacerbates Russia's own fears, that perception of encirclement. And so you get into this vicious circle, this dynamic in which offense and defense reinforce one another and things start to escalate. And it's not an easy thing to handle. And we're going to have to work out some ground rules, some rules of the game for managing this problem. And everyone's going to have to be involved. The US, Russia, Europe, and these states themselves.
That was my final question. What is the prescription in your book, Russia Trap, to solve?
Well, a lot of things have to happen at once, and we're not very good at that. We like to break down problems into their component parts and solve each one incrementally. You work on the easy ones first, and you build some momentum that makes it easier to tackle the harder problems later on when you've generated some success and goodwill. But when you're dealing with a systems problem, which I think we've got here, where all these factors are interconnected and they reinforce or diminish one another, you can't approach things that way. You're going to have to tackle things more holistically. So it means we've got to do a lot of things at once. We have to lock and chew gum here. We've got to tackle the Ukrainian problem not just within the parameters of Ukraine. We've got to tackle the broader question of Europe's security architecture. And we've got to tackle these broader questions about interference in internal politics. We've got to do it all at once. And that can create a virtuous circle that helps us make some progress here. But we're not very good at doing that. I'm not sure we even recognize that we have to approach things that way. That's part of what I'm trying to point out in the book.
That's a depressing note to end on, but thank you very much, George Beebe, the author of the new book, Russia Trap, for joining us here on CN Live. You're watching CN Live on Consortium News. I'm Joe Lauria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss. Join us every Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern.
We're streaming through consortiumnews.com.
And on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and DLive.
CN Live.
Your weekly insight into the news.
Well, we're back live now on CN Live after that discussion with George Beebe and Elizabeth Voss and myself. Covered a lot of territory there, but there's more territory to go. We've got 3 guests that are joining us now live to carry this discussion forward on Russia. In North Carolina, we have Ray McGovern, former Russia analyst at the CIA. And in Northern Connecticut, we have Patrick Lawrence, who is a journalist who worked for the International Herald Tribune in Asia and Hong Kong, I believe you were mostly based, Patrick. He was editor there. He's written for the New Yorker magazine and The Nation. And now he's a contributor to Consortium News, and we're very happy to have him. And joining us, I assume, from the Albany, New York area. Is that correct, Scott?
Correct.
Scott Ritter. Scott is a former U.S. Marine counterintelligence official, and he was then a member of UNSCOM, which was the first version of the weapons inspection team that went into Iraq following the first Gulf War that was set up by the Security Council. And Ralph Achaeus, I remember his boss, because I was at the UN in those days. And Scott is very kind to come and join us today to discuss Russia. And Scott has written a piece about Russia we'll get into. But Ray, I'd like to start with you about Beebe in general. You heard what he had to say. Does he get it for a former CIA guy? From a former CIA guy?
Well, I was pleasantly surprised that he was as candid as he was. He seemed to be agreeing with a lot of what you said, a lot of what others have said. And what bothered me a little was, he's still stuck in this kind of, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. And but don't forget, the Russians are at least equally responsible for this, even if it's like a U.S. coup on the Maidan in Kiev, Russia is at least equally responsible. It was all this kind of business about, well, at the end, which would be freshest in the mind of people watching, at the end he said something like, "Oh, yeah, what Russia is doing is defensive, but you have to remember that they see their whole shtick, their whole existence as depending on being a great power. And so if they're not a great power, that's an existential problem. And so, well, what does that mean? That means that when you're working in the government, you got to lean forward. And when the predominant attitude is, Russia is trying to reassert its great power status, trying to get as powerful as the old Soviet Union, it's a little bit disheartening to see a person who clearly knows which end is up and agrees with most of the things that most of us think, really unable to say the Russian is adnaka. However, adnaka. However, the Russians can't be exculpated for this because they're partly responsible. Well, there's certain things that they're not partly responsible for. But the ingrained attitude in Washington is that you have to blame them at least equally if you can, and at least mention that it's not the U.S. who's solely responsible for these indignities, but it is indeed Russia. So those were my general thoughts. I'd be happy to consult my notes on more particular things he said or consult my memory. But by and large, I was encouraged. And I'm wondering where he's been for the last couple of years. I mean, hello, was it 2004 to 2008? What's he been doing since then? I mean, his voice would have been very helpful saying the things that he said today.
Indeed, and he discussed about whether officials were true believers or whether they, in fact, had a cynical view. Sounds like he knew what was going on all along, or unless he had some kind of epiphany recently. Patrick, when we were chatting before, you used a very spicy term to describe what you thought of his analysis. Could you expound on that, please?
Happy to. I don't think I'm quite so forgiving as Mr. McGovern. I found him at every crucial turn an apologist, right? Apologetic for American conduct. And as Ray said, we always must, in Beebe's view, it always must land at joint responsibility, et cetera, okay? I liked what he said about the nature of the government in Russia in the 90s after the Soviet Union fell. He had the take there, pretty good, dysfunctional. But I was quite shocked to hear him say, we didn't expect that. We really thought we were going in there to make Russia a gleaming free market democracy, right? I really do have trouble with these sorts of thoughts. And at every crucial turn, Ukraine, Georgia, he was apologetic, right? And one of the big ones for me was when he was discussing the international order and picking apart whether we were entering an era where there had to be rules. He acknowledged this. I was refreshed, right? That was good, right? He understands that the world is changing. You don't get that thought very often out of Washington. But then he said, it really is a question whether we have to start conforming to these rules or not. That was kind of a neck snapper for me, right? So essentially, this fellow is a kind of neo-exceptionalist, okay? And if there's one thing we Americans have to let go of, it's this died in us notion of ourselves as exceptions in the global context. It's the wellspring of most of our mistakes, right? And on that point, I just thought, this guy is probably quite reflective of the thinking in Washington. and that depressed me. People are, you get the impression that people in Washington are willing to think things through, but they will never depart from the basics. Do you see what I mean? Right? They will never they will never exit the presumptions we have carried forward since bloody 1630. Okay? And that's our problem, and it's the world's problem at this point.
Well, you're right. And you wonder about this guy because he seems definitely to be straddling two sides here. He's one foot outside the establishment where he's trying to make his mark, but the other foot seems very firmly planted in it. And I wonder whether he just doesn't want to alienate himself from the Washington establishment, where he seems to think that he needs to depend on in order to carry on with this phase of his career, which is an analyst and a writer. And I don't get that, because he should be independent right now. It would seem that he would be able to go all the way. I don't give him the excuse, I don't know if you agree, Scott, that he doesn't fully understand all of these things. And that he's just feels he can only go so far, but he's very consciously going to the edge and then pulling himself back.
Yeah, I get that too.
Scott, what was your impression?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to understand who he is and what he is. Ray knows this. He's a CIA-trained analyst. That doesn't happen by happenstance. He was recruited. He was interviewed. There was a bunch of people that listened to him expound on, his knowledge of all things Soviet/Russia, and they approved of it. And then he went through a training program, and then he spent a career adapting to the CIA way of doing business. That's ingrained in him. That's his approach. And you can't expect the day he stops working for them. First of all, you don't stop working unless you're somebody like Ray or myself who have divorced ourselves from the government. At the end of the day, he'll be brought back as an expert. He'll be brought back as a consultant. There will be an income stream. He'll be speaking at think tanks, etc. And he has to conform to the mainstream. So I think the way to treat him isn't to say, what is he saying as his main argument, but to understand that on the periphery, he is deviating from the mainstream, and that's a victory. The more of these intelligence professionals we can get to deviate, even if it's just on the periphery from the main story, the more we generate debate, the more we generate discussion. And that's the point. We're never going to change his mind. You need to accept that. You're not going to change his mind. But what you can do is, through a discussion with him, affect the thinking of the people who are watching this program. And that's the most important thing.
Well, I mean, Ray is a CIA-trained analyst, and look what happened to him. Maybe Beebe has to grow a beard at the same length.
Maybe he has to grow a beard.
You reached the same ripe age, to be able to see this.
No, nothing happened to Ray. Ray chose to do what he's doing. Right?
Well,
Active tense.
I was lucky because I could leave. I was old enough, believe it or not, to leave at age 50. And I had the requisite service overseas and so forth. So just as it was getting really bad, just as Bobby Gates and Bill Casey were really screwing up, I was able to leave. I'd like to make a couple of small points here. One is that, Bebbe is one of those who stayed in his position as head of Russian analysis. You have to lean forward. This is a expression I got from an intelligence community officer, a pretty high level. He was seconded to the intelligence community staff, and he was from NSA. And I said, why did you falsify the information before Iraq? And he said, well, we were told to lean forward. We were told to lean forward, so that's what we did. As if leaning forward was all right, I mean, there was no apology in his tone, but we were leaning forward.
What does that phrase mean? I don't get that.
Well, it means that, if the Russians are the incarnate evil, that you really have to kind of lean forward and sort of dovetail your views on Russia, and especially what you say about Russia, so that nobody can say, well, don't you believe that they're incarnate evil? And most of that had to do with Iraq and other things. But the Russians were right in there. Of course, we had Bolton getting out of the ABM treaty, which Scott knows more about than anybody. And we had all kinds of bad things happening. I never heard any demurral from Beebe because he was sort of leading forward. Now, that's not an excuse. One can understand that's how he stayed in it. Now it should be different. I think I argue strongly it should be different. He knows what the leaning forward was. Now it's more a case of preserving your position, as Scott said, with appropriate cynicism. So they'll be back, invited back to train people in Russian studies and all that kind of stuff. And you'll have an income stream, as Scott so artfully put it. So he's part of the establishment, and he can't simply answer your question, Joe, and say, yeah, there was a coup on the Maidan. And the Russians weren't responsible for that anyway. You just can't say that. None of the Russians, So that's how I see it. It's an unfortunate thing. But I guess if you want to accentuate the positive, as I think Scott was doing, he made a step. I think we ought to reach out to him. I think we ought to say, well, all right, you say it pretty much the way we do. Now, haven't you looked at the evidence on Russiagate? Don't you think that's important? How can you sit back and say, well, I'm not sure, whether the Russian, how can you justify that? You're supposed to be head of Russian analysis. You've had a lot of reading to do for the last 8 years. What do you really think? I mean, it's not okay to say, well, I don't know, there's a lot of stories. A lot of people believe this, other people believe that. I think we need to strengthen the back of these folks and make sure we hold them accountable.
Very, very spongy he was on that point.
Yeah.
I wonder if being ostracized was not also one of his socially here in the U.S. and Washington in particular. You have to hold certain views, and he's going outside the conventional wisdom a bit. And as you say, that's welcome. Patrick, I want to move to. I would like to ask Scott too about the ABM now that I know you know more than anybody else. But I wanted to bring up Patrick's article that he did in Consortium News a couple of days ago. And he was focusing on some remarks that I didn't think got a lot of play in the U.S. media, which were made by Emmanuel Macron at the G7 summit, which he seemed to be coming out and saying, well, one of two things, that, we really got to get along with the Russians because European economic, especially in Germany, economy is dependent on a good relationship. But others are interpreting also as this Kissinger view that 30 years ago he said we had to split China off from Russia, and he apparently said 30 years from now we've got to do the opposite. So we've got to split Russia off from China. So I was wondering, Patrick, if you could just explain, in your piece you raised the question whether we maybe have seen the worst of this new Cold War. Is there a possibility that there's a change in thinking in the establishment of Russia? So tell us what you said in this article.
You put two questions. Have we seen the worst of it? I can't rule on that. I kind of doubt it. But Macron was quite interesting, and these remarks were very candid. The big one was the era of Western hegemony. We are living through the end of Western hegemony. That's a rather large thought, right? I mean, I've had it for quite a long time. I imagine everybody on this program has, But chronology is interesting here. He actually delivered that speech to a group of European ambassadors immediately after G7, immediately after Biarritz, back in Paris. Now, why do I mention that? Because he huddled with Trump in Biarritz. It was in Biarritz that Trump said, maybe we can throw a lifeline, a line of credit to Iran, right? It was in Biarritz that Trump said, I think we should have Russia back into the G7 and make it the G8 again. So that was the noise in Biarritz. And I think what Macron said reflected his conversations with Trump. And I suspect we cannot know. So much of statecraft now is submerged, right? It's rather hard to write about it sometimes, right? We cannot know exactly what was said, but there's a strong suggestion that he had dispensations from Trump, right? That's how I read it. And I've also heard since then that it's quite questionable whether President Putin would take an interest in rejoining the G7 and making it a reconstituted G8. He has remarked, it really doesn't mean that much as long as China and India are not part of it. It's a rather interesting point to consider, right? But Macron, in European politics, Macron is somewhat of a lightweight, okay? He's second fiddle to Chancellor Merkel, and he wants to make a mark, right? So how will he do that? Well, he does take a certain pride in being one of the only Europeans who can bear a conversation with Donald Trump, right? That's perhaps to his credit, right? And so I think the indications are he may want to be a sort of bridge across the Atlantic from the continent to Washington. He may want to play that role. He may want to have sort of Gaullist fantasies the way Boris Johnson has. Every PM in England seems to have Churchillian fantasies, right? He may want to be a somewhat of a neo-Gaullist and say, we Europeans need to act on our own interests now. It's an interesting thought, but a lot of us have been twiddling our thumbs for decades waiting for that sort of thing to occur, right? And it doesn't. So bearing in mind Macron's somewhat, his sort of welterweight status in European, among the major European powers, we have to see where this goes. But brilliant that these things were articulated. Wonderful. Right?
But it's gone away. I mean, there's no ramifications from those remarks. As you say, the ending lesson headline,
no take-up. Nobody's picked up this theme. Right?
So he's playing to a goal. He's trying to, as you say, try to seem like he's Charles de Gaulle, and I'll believe that when he takes France out of NATO.
Wouldn't we love that? And also, don't forget, he's not doing well on the domestic side with the Gilets jaunes and all that stuff, right? So here's another chance for him to look splendid, statesman.
It was all to effect. You don't think he really meant much of it?
Well, I mean, one awaits, but I think it's just as we were saying with Bebbe, the note was sounded good enough, right? In the same way with Macron, these things were articulated. I was stunned and quite pleased.
Scott, should we be bothering? Should we be talking about what Macron said at all?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, there's something going on here that most Americans only pick up on the periphery, and that's a no-deal Brexit. That's becoming a distinct reality. And it's not just about what's going to happen with the United Kingdom and Great Britain. It's what's going to happen to Europe. There's a struggle going on in Europe about what the future of Europe's going to look like in a post-Brexit environment. What people don't understand is 27% of the European economy is going to be gutted. It's gone. And what happens to the European Bank? Who's going to underwrite all this liberal financing that Macron's been pushing the Germans to do, to the distinct disadvantage of the German bankers, who are very unhappy with having to underwrite Italy and Portugal and all these other failing economies? We had a situation where Germany was starting to harden its position and take the lead on reconciliation with Russia, the reality that they need Nord Stream 2. They need gas coming in. They need normalization of relations. And in a hard exit, a no-deal Brexit, Europe is going to split into two camps. One camp is going to be led by Germany and the more conservative nations that are going to speak about the need for economic conservatism. The other camp is going to be led by Paris, by Macron, by France, which is going to talk about the need to freely lend money to these failing economies, to prop them up, to keep the euro afloat. And to do this, though, you can't be buying into the American philosophy of confronting Russia on a continuous basis. And so I think what Macron is doing is recognizing that the future of Europe is dependent upon not allowing, as he said, not allowing Europe to become a battleground between the United States and a China backed by Russia. That there's going to be this fight, this struggle that's going to go on for decades between the United States and China. Do you want Russia to be aligned with China and therefore turn Europe into a battleground? Or do you want to draw Russia back into Europe so that the Europeans can stand to one side and let the Americans and the Chinese duke it out? I think that's where Macron's coming from. Whether he has the gravitas, whether he has the resume to pull it off, as Patrick said, he is no Angela Merkel. His economy is not the German economy. Maybe his bark is a heck of a lot more than his bite, but he threw his hat into the ring. He's a player right now. And the fact is, you're right. He whispered in the ear of Trump. There's something going on between Trump and him. There's a wink and a nod taking place. These things don't occur in a vacuum. So maybe Macron has the backing of the United States to initiate this dialogue, to begin the discussion about bringing Russia back into the fold.
I agree with what Scott just said. I also would like to refer back to what Patrick said. It's more than rhetoric. If memory serves, didn't Macron offer Iran some substantial economic credits or whatever?
A $15 billion bailout, yes.
Yeah, and didn't he?
Negotiation now.
Yeah, and didn't he also, as has been said, whisper in Trump's ear, it might be a good idea to invite the Iranian foreign minister, who is persona non grata in the U.S., and maybe you might want to talk to Rouhani. You could do it at the UN in New York, I think there's a lot of whispering, but I think that Trump, now that he's rid of Bolton, he might be able to listen to these people, even if Macron is in it for his own profile. It seems that there's more substance to just the rhetoric. And I applaud Patrick for describing all these straws in the wind, which I think do add up to something not right now. Patrick wasn't suggesting something right now. But if you look at all these things, you see that, well, Macron is playing a very interesting role. And he apparently not only can bear talking to Trump, but he can whisper in his ear, and wonder of wonders, Trump listens.
And Patrick made another point in his piece about the editorial in the New York Times, which seemed to be taking a similar line, saying it was time to get closer to Russia because China's the real enemy. I mean, I hadn't read that editorial. I was a bit surprised by that. Patrick, is this part of what we're seeing? As you say, they listen to their establishment sources.
It got me out of the chair when I read that. The Times is Russophobia central, right? Russiagate central too, I might add, right?
Well, it was.
So, the question became, it was a very directly worded editorial. And if you know the Times, I worked there at one point. If you know how the paper works and thinks, there's a reason why these things appear. And as I said in the column, quite notable, it was a lead editorial. That suggests to me that Times upper management, publisher's office, executive editor's office have been conferring in Washington. That sort of thing doesn't slip out by happenstance. In the news columns, you may note, it is still droning on about Russia as our number one problem and so on and so forth. But that editorial still stands, right? It's very interesting that way. And what I say about the Times, my take on how that editorial landed there is well supported in the histories of the paper and the histories of the CIA and so on and so forth. One of the Sulzbergers, I think it was Arthur Hayes, back in the, 50s or 60s, he was the publisher, was actually a CIA operative. That's in the books, right? And so these things cannot be doubted. Equally, certain correspondents I prefer not to name are forever mentioning in their pieces, this has been checked with the National Security Agency, and they have said that there's no harm in publishing it, et cetera, et cetera. So you really do have a very poisonous, well, you and I are hacks together, Joe, right? You really do have a very poisonous relationship between the New York Times and power in Washington. It really astonishes me that it goes on like this, but there we go, right?
Russophobia.
This is why I put weight on that editorial, right?
You know that last night the Democrats had this debate, and I read that the word Russia did not appear once. No one Whereas that's all they talked about not too long ago. They're not talking about it at all right.
You want to know what I think there? Russiagate has collapsed. Everybody wants to find the side exit, and they can't find one. And so the solution available is just don't talk about it.
Extraordinary. Yes, sir.
Well, you have the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Paquette. He briefs his people, and we have the transcript. Look, he doesn't say it outright, but he says, we're really screwed up on Russiagate. 2 years plus. Look, let's get him on. Oh, racism. Yeah, racist. Yeah, he's a racist. Let's get him on that. And maybe, yeah, corruption. Corruption's good too. But hey, stop already with the Russiagate. Well, what happens? 1 week later, David Sadler and all these guys do this item that Scott has dissected so beautifully. I've seen Scott's draft, and it's quite a wonder to see. Well, screw Paquette. We do our own thing here, and our best source, John Brennan, man, we have to help him out now because he's in deep kimchi. And so what we'll do is strengthen the big lacuna here. The lacuna being that special source that Brennan sent around in a sealed, double sealed, triple sealed envelope saying, aha, Putin personally ordered the hacking of the DNC. That was incredible. That was not possible to believe at the time. Now we have Brennan really squirming, and the New York Times trying to consult us and construct this elaborate explanation of how this went down and giving a last gasp reality to it as best they can. The whole thing is falling apart, but not without a lot of last gasps, because Brennan, Clapper, Comey, in an ideal world, they'll end up in jail. I don't know if that's going to happen, but at least the evidence is out there. Congress has it. DOJ has it. The special prosecutors now working Durham and so forth have it. So they have the wherewithal to do this. And here's the New York Times still trying to protect the source that gave them all this great information about Russiagate and how the Russians interfered. It's really quite remarkable.
That was a good segue into Scott's piece, which will be appearing on Consortium News after this broadcast. Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about it? Is it possible to talk a little about this? Quite an involved story, but if you could just tease it out a little bit without giving the whole thing away.
We know a couple things happened between April of 2016 and June of 2016. There was a cyber event that occurred at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. Emails were accessed, and they ended up being published. There's some controversy about this. The Democratic Party, working with CrowdStrike, a notoriously anti-Russian cybersecurity firm, and working implicitly, at least, or on the sidelines with the FBI, who sat back and let this happen, created this mythology of the Russians hacking the Democratic National Committee and then deliberately leaking the information gained from this attack to the media in a way that damaged Hillary Clinton's candidacy. This became an attack on American democracy. One of the problems, though, in the June timeframe is that the FBI hadn't bought into that scenario yet. They weren't ready. The FBI wasn't ready to go public with this information. The other thing that was happening about this time is that a gentleman named Christopher Steele, a British intelligence, former British intelligence operative, was starting to publish reports that he had prepared based upon his so-called intelligence sources, reports that were paid for by the Democratic Party, and apparently were written for the explicit purpose of undermining the Trump campaign and assisting Hillary Clinton. And one of the key reports at this time that was getting attention dealt with Carter Page, a Trump advisor who had traveled to Moscow in July. This information was being floated by Brennan to Harry Reid and to other congressmen in the late July, early August timeframe. Even though ostensibly the FBI hadn't taken control of this information, it was definitely in the hands of Harry Reid. He all but admits it. But even that doesn't have enough bite. Something has to happen. Suddenly, John Brennan comes up with, oh, there's a third piece of information, too. The NSA was floating this SIGINT report that alluded to the Russians being involved and perhaps Putin calling the shots. But the NSA, National Security Agency, was backing off from this report. So you didn't have enough to get your teeth into it until Brennan suddenly showed up with this white envelope. The envelope contained an intelligence report from a human source. Not just any human source, the most secret human source in the world, apparently. So secret that John Brennan had to take personal control of this source. He pulled it out of the CIA apparatus responsible for dealing with this. In this case, the Europe and Eurasian Mission Center. It's something that was new, that came up in 2015, that brought together the former Directorate of Operations, the clandestine side, who recruits human intelligence assets, and the Directorate of Intelligence, the analytical side, and brought them together in a joint effort to effectively manage the Russian intelligence problem. Apparently that wasn't good enough, even though this was Brennan's brainchild, the mission. He pulled this source out of that, created his own special fusion cell of hand-picked analysts from the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, so they could merge this human intelligence report with the NSA SIGINT, with Christopher Steele's report, to come up with a narrative about how Russia interfered. He took this report, which said that President Putin personally ordered the attack on the Democratic National Convention, and it was done to tip the scales in favor of Donald Trump. He took this report straight to the president. Now, Ray knows you don't get information in front of the president by accident, not if you're the CIA. There's a document called the Presidential Daily Brief. And it's not just a document, it's a system. It's a way of doing business. Information that makes it to the brief is vetted very carefully. You just don't throw any information in front of the president. And for this human source to have been briefed to the president using the daily brief methodology, it probably wouldn't have made it, because there are some problems with this human source. There was, first of all, and again, Ray knows this. If you have a human source reporting and you've tested his access and it's limited access, and suddenly out of the blue, he comes up with the report, the one that answers every question you ever had, the one that makes you feel good about every narrative you put forward, the one that says that Putin is responsible. That's a red flag in and of itself. And the counterintelligence staff will immediately call to halt and say, we need to check, why is suddenly this guy getting the access he's getting? Well, Brennan didn't allow that to occur. He pulled the source from the center, took control of it, and then bypassed the Presidential Daily Brief to go straight to Barack Obama and his inner circle and say, look what I got. Look what I got. And it impacted things because the president acted on this. And again, Ray knows this. If you're the CIA and you get the president to act on something, that's a big deal. That's huge. Obama went straight to Putin at the G20 meeting, looked Putin in the eye and said, we know what you're doing. Stop it. I think Putin was feeling pretty good at that point in time, because I don't want to give away the farm, but there's part of me that says there's a reason why this counterintelligence community raised a red flag. And that might be that this report wasn't everything that John Brennan and the CIA purported to be. And now today, in this post-Mueller environment, we have Attorney General Barr launching an investigation into this very report, because he recognizes that that is the Genesis moment. This report began the process of the politicization of intelligence to interfere with the electoral processes of the United States of America. And if Barr can get his hands on this information, learn more about this source, learn how it was mismanaged, learn how this information was not treated properly, that can be the end of a lot of careers in Congress and elsewhere.
A lot of people have been saying that, and I think it's a kind of an insult to people with brains. They say that John Brennan was the brains behind this whole Russiagate. You know, when he gave that report to Harry Reid, he said, "Harry, the FBI needs to know about this. What are you going to do?" And Harry Reid dutifully went right to the FBI and said, "Oh, why aren't you looking into that?" And the FBI was already pre-alerted because Brennan and Comey and Clapper were all working from the same script. So yeah, my notion, just to finish up a little comment on this, is that Brennan, when he took control of this, he still had to go through, the requirements people. And so he says to one of the handlers of Smolenko, he says, now, we need to know how deeply involved Putin personally was in interfering. We need to ask him that. Now, if I'm Smolenko and I'm reading the Western as well as the Eastern press, I know that Brennan's way out on a limb, and others too, saying, oh, this is Putin. Nobody would authorize this except Putin. And so he knows the right answer to give. He's working for money. He doesn't want to be shut down. And so he gives this report, sends it back, or however he does it. And he says, oh, yeah, involved. Putin orchestrated the whole thing. And you put that in your memo, sure. And of course, he gets an extra $1 million for that in the bank for saying what the correct answer was. So when, and hopefully it happens, when Barr and the other prosecutors and the inspectors general, when they look into this, they have the paper. They already know about Brennan. The real question is, will they have the guts? Will they have the courage to cross the intelligence agencies? Now, 1 week before they briefed President-elect Trump, Chuck Schumer was on Rachel Maddow. And so this is the 3rd of January, 2017. They briefed the president on the 6th of January. Now, Chuck has this to say. He says, Rachel, I used to think Trump was a pretty bright guy, but smart businessman, but no, he's done something really, really foolish. And she said, oh, what would that be, Chuck? And Chuck said, well, he's crossed the intelligence community, and they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. So I don't know what he's doing, but he's doing something really very foolish. Now, you can be sure that Trump's people briefed him on that. You can be sure they read it. Well, hopefully they read it as, this kind of warning. You don't come into Washington green and confront the intelligence agencies. And so when Comey stayed behind after briefing the president-elect and said, now, Mr. Trump, I don't know how to tell you this. I mean, it's very embarrassing, but we have this dossier, and it tells about, well, it alleges that during your trip to Moscow, you were consorting with prostitutes. It's really awful. Here's a couple excerpts from it. We just want to let you know that it's out there. It could be hit the press, And Trump is green. He doesn't know Washington. He doesn't know that FBI directors do that to every incoming president. So he says, my God, I didn't do this. And it now's come out that Comey was trying to see whether he'd admit it or say something stupid. But Trump says, no, I didn't admit it. So a couple months later, when Trump fires Comey, what does he say? I fired him because of this Russia thing. Now, everybody interprets that as because he was trying to cover up his collusion with Russia. No, it wasn't that. It was this incredible confrontation where Comey stayed behind. The others went. He said, now, Mr. President, just so you know, we don't know. Well, it's not verified, but this is really scurrilous. Just so you know, okay? So you have Chuck Schumer on the 3rd. You have Comey on the 6th. No wonder when the president finally took the oath of office, he had gotten the message and knew that he had to pay defense for at least 2 years. Now, maybe the people advising him, like Barr, will have the guts to pursue this because the paper trail is there. Last thing I'll say is the reason the paper trail is there is because they were sure Hillary was going to win. And you have Comey himself saying that in his book, and I quote, I was operating in an environment where I was sure that Hillary Clinton would be the next president of the United States, period, end quote. Why hide the paper trail? She's in like Flynn, so to speak. So you take all kinds of, you don't do tradecraft, you don't do due diligence, you just let it all hang out there. That paper is available now to the prosecutor Durham, to the IGs and so forth. So the question really will be whether the president will put down the deep state with the evidence he has, or whether he'll choose, as he has in the past, kind of Morning. We're going to release all the rest of the intelligence from the CIA on the JFK assassination. Morning, 10 o'clock. Afternoon, 3:30. Change what I said this morning. The CIA and the FBI say we can't release that. We'll look at it again in 6 months. What happens in 6 months? Nada, nothing, nichevo. So it's really going to hit the fan now, and whether the fan shows these people up for what they are really depends on the courage and the cojones of the people in charge, namely Trump and Barr.
Trump and Barr have a huge problem right now, Ray. You know that if you've recruited a human intelligence asset, we keep calling it recruitment. It's an employment contract. It's a contract between the CIA and the employee, the recruit. It's a contract for services rendered. You get paid this money for doing this job. Now, that money is held in escrow until the time comes when you come out of the cold, you come home, etc. But before you get that money, you got to go through an extremely detailed debriefing. They have to confirm that, in fact, you carried out in good faith the contract, the deal. They're going to polygraph you. They're going to run through each report. They're going to scrub everything. It takes a long time. And then and only then do they go, good job, here's your money, go live a good life. We're going to turn you over to the resettlement people, give you a new name, a new ID, some disguises, and you're going to come into the farm every once in a while and brief people. But, you know, you did a good job. Now go live as somebody that nobody will ever know again. But what happens if you're this great asset who just delivered the report, the most important report ever delivered by a human asset in the history of the United States, because this one proves that the Russian president attacked the United States, ordered an attack. What happens when that source gets fired by the Russian government? And then when the CIA says, oh my God, you got fired, you have to leave now. They're going to arrest you and put you on trial. We're going to execute the exfiltration plan. And he goes, no, I'm not leaving. And then he doesn't get arrested. Not only does he not get arrested, he's allowed to wander the streets. He's allowed to take his passport. He's allowed to take his family. He's allowed to take his bank account and go on vacation in Montenegro and then disappear. Now, if you're a CIA counterintelligence person, the moment he got fired, you issue a burn notice. You know that's what they do. You know they would issue a burn notice immediately and say, never use this information again until we find out what's going on. But they couldn't issue a burn notice. Why? Because while this was happening, the intelligence community was preparing their assessment. Not a real assessment, a fake assessment, the one that wasn't done by a national intelligence officer, the one that wasn't done by the National Intelligence Council, the one that wasn't coordinated with the mission center, the one that John Brennan and Clapper were cooking up with their handful of analysts, that was built on one piece of information. The information that said Putin ordered this. Right. You couldn't burn that, because if you burned that, you had no assessment. And that was the assessment ordered by Barack Obama to be finished prior to Donald Trump being sworn in as president. This is the problem they have. Information will not pass any smell test.
May I interject here briefly? I would love to put what Scott Ritter just said against George Beebe's description of people in Washington as believing the things they say, and they are not cynically constructing narratives that they know are not true, right? Think about what Ritter just said in the context of Beebe's remark.
To be fair to Beebe, he did say he didn't think it was centralized. He did not think that this hack came from the president of Russia. He did say that as well.
He did.
I don't know what he knows, but he also said that. I think the guy's going to leave it there. I think we got our appetites whetted just a little bit to read Scott Ritter's piece that will be appearing in Consortium News. Log on. They'll be up all weekend. It is more extraordinary than what he's given us tonight. I really want to thank you guys. This was really quite a discussion. Ray McGovern, Patrick Lawrence, and Scott Ritter. Thanks so much for joining us at CN Live.
Thank you very much.
Now we're going to turn to our interview with Tony Kevin, the former Australian ambassador who spent 2 years in Soviet Russia in Moscow at the Australian Embassy from 69 to 71. book recently returned to Moscow, and we interviewed him because of the time difference. We had to record it, and it's coming up right now. Well, we're now joined from Canberra, Australia, the capital, by Tony Kevin. Tony was the ambassador from Australia to Cambodia and to Poland, and in between 1969 and 1971, in the Brezhnev years, he was a junior diplomat in the Australian embassy in Moscow. And we're very, very happy to have him with us. He's going to talk to us about a speech that he gave on Thursday night in Canberra, which was extraordinarily interesting. Also about his recently published book, Return to Moscow, which he actually did return to Moscow after all those years and compared the Soviet days to what he saw now, and the revelations that were made to him and his understanding of Russia today. And we also want to talk to him about George Beebe's interview that we just saw. So, Tony, welcome to CN Live.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So let's start with George Beebe's speech, former CIA Russia desk chief. Did you get a lot out of it? Did you agree with him on the whole?
I got a lot out of it. I agreed with him almost totally. I think it's remarkable that an ex-CIA man can be so perceptive and to have so much empathy towards Russia, because I think one of the problems with the CIA at the moment, and particularly with its former head, who's now the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, is that they're completely lacking empathy for Russia. Pompeo went to Moscow, had talks with Lavrov, saw Putin. He came away seemingly completely unaffected by it, unlike his predecessor, Tillerson, who I think had achieved some empathy and some rapport with how Russia sees the world. And I don't know how you can be a head of a CIA, much less a Secretary of State, if you lack that quality of empathy. And George Beebe really had it in spades. So I thoroughly recommend his interview.
He seemed to point out that a lot of officials in Washington and in the intelligence agencies, in the foreign policy establishment, lack this ability to put themselves in the shoes of the other side. And I found that extraordinary because it seemed like they weren't even trying to do that, let alone being unable to do that. It could be difficult when there's a radically different culture. And you have to do that, don't you, Tony? You're a diplomat. Isn't that imperative on a diplomat? I certainly think a journalist, that is, as a foreign correspondent, you certainly must do that. Isn't that what a diplomat should be trained to do?
Coming from a small to medium-sized country, one learns that one has to do that, otherwise one's going to be laughed at. The problem is that for the United States, if I may say so, and I have a lot of American friends, there is this certain type of American, and let's say Pinkerton in Madame Butterfly, or let's say the protagonist in Graham Greene's The Quiet American, who can only see things from the point of view of America's manifest destiny and basically right to control the world. And when you've got that mindset, which unfortunately has infected even the State Department in recent years, because the military intelligence complex has really taken over Washington policymaking. So when large numbers of people have that, shall I say, born to rule manifest destiny mindset, it's very hard to establish the sort of equal, mutually respectful dialogue with countries like Russia and China that George Beebe very correctly says is now necessary, given the changes in the power relationships in the world.
Well, you were able to then, when you were in Moscow in the Cold War, even then, at the height of the Cold War, one of the tense parts of the Cold War, there was, you were able to try to see things from the way the Soviets saw the United States and saw the world. Is that right?
Yes, I did. And in my book, I talk about a friend in the embassy, Lauria Matheson, who became rather notorious in subsequent years. He taught me to see things the way Russia sees them. And it's essentially about geography. Russia has no natural borders to the West, and it's been open for centuries to invasion from the West. And the worst invasions of Russia have not been the Mongols, because the Mongols somehow worked through local deputies, but from the West, which actually tried to change the culture and the religion of the places they conquered. So you've got this history of centuries of armies sweeping backwards and forwards across the Great Plain between Germany and Russia with no protections. I was taken by Lauria to the Battle of Poltava, which is in Ukraine, the battlegrounds. And this was where Russia, Peter the Great's forces, decisively defeated King Charles of Sweden's European coalition, which was invading Russia, way down in the Ukraine, about 500 kilometers south of Moscow. And that was the end of the Swedish Empire. And it was, if you like, the beginning of Russia as a great power. Russians are intensely patriotic. They will argue among themselves about faults in their government and so on. They really hate it when foreign powers basically try to control and manipulate them.
As any nation would. I think the United States, even when they aren't being controlled and manipulated, think that they are, like the last 3 years of Russiagate. So, Elizabeth, why don't you ask a few questions? Tony, please.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I was wanting to ask you about the point you make about the public being so swayed and numbed by mainstream news sources, when they're told basically narratives that are made up of disinformation over and over again, narratives that interlock. I was wondering, though, because the way that you describe that is that it is basically successful. And I was wondering what you think about at least in the United States, we have polls showing that a great quadrant of the public, a very, growing number of people amongst the public no longer trust the mainstream media sources. So do you think that's a changing situation, or do you think it is basically, maybe in Australia, really a successful propaganda narrative?
We're a little way behind you, Elizabeth. I agree with you that there is a resistance developing to the propaganda narrative. One of the things that we've learned, and I talked about this in my lecture, is that this hasn't happened accidentally. There has been a whole science of really controlling public opinion through establishing internet nodes of influence, clusters of influence, that will then provide a diverse range of sources, different sources, and massive repetition of false messages. Now, this works until you're inoculated against it by knowing what's happening. Down here in Australia, we have a terrific person called Caitlin Johnston at KDOS, who's probably leading the what we might call the waking up of Australia. We're not quite as far down the road as you are in America with wonderful programs like your Consortium News. We haven't got a program like this in Australia. We haven't got access to mainstream media. We haven't got access to the Australian Broadcasting Commission. But unfortunately, we're confined to social media websites like Caitlin's, and we're doing our best, and we're trying to catch up with you.
Absolutely a fan of Caitlin Johnstone, huge fan of Caitlin Johnstone's work, and I really liked that you included her work in your talk. And you mentioned the information warfare, and that ties into the Integrity Initiative. And I thought that it was really interesting the way that you discussed Orwell and his kind of prophetic vision of this information warfare, and that prophetic vision being basically fulfilled in his own country by the Integrity Initiative. So for the parts of our audience who maybe aren't familiar with that, because as you point out, it has not been covered almost at all in mainstream press. Can you describe the Integrity Initiative and the scandal surrounding that?
I'm glad to, and I'd follow that up hopefully with a quick discussion of Orwell and doublethink, because I think that's very important. But on the actual technology, a group of anonymous hackers who call themselves Anonymous late last year hacked and dumped huge quantities of original documents from the Integrity Initiative and the Institute for Statecraft, which are two rather shadowy bodies funded by the British government to the tune of about $3 million a year, and given all kinds of other help through embassy space and access to communications and so on. They are a bunch of ex-spooks, ex-army spooks, and similar types who see it as their mission to basically counter Russian disinformation. And they are obsessively wild-eyed, riveted-eyed anti-Russian people. They function out of a semi-secret premises in London, and they go around Europe and they basically recruit people in the same way in which spies are recruited, but these people are not spies, and they're not even agents of influence in traditional sense of people who influence government. They're people who are influencing the mass public through their speeches, their conferences, their symposia, their internet activity. And because there are so many of them, it provides this massive diversity of forces and basically swamping the market with anti-Russian disinformation messages. And they have been very, very effective. And even though Britain is a much smaller country than America, in a funny sort of way, they're the Greeks to America's Romans, because they are providing a lot of the intellectual impetus behind the malign, it's a word that they like to use, a malign Western disinformation campaign against Russia. And finally, there's a wonderful little 7-minute video, which a man called Colonel, what's his name? I've got a mental blank, but you know who I mean. He made a 7-minute YouTube video, and it makes wonderful watching, because you have to really watch him and see him justifying or trying to justify the work of this organisation.
Donnelly,
now, a quick word on Orwell's disinformation. Orwell's doublethink. Orwell predicted the capacity of people working in a big bureaucratic government propaganda system to doublethink, to put thoughts in and out of their mind as necessary to do their job. And it's a wonderful quote from Orwell, and I recommend people find it and read it. It's in chapter 3, because it's exactly what so many of our people in and around government and academic circles around government do. They have narratives which they can push in and out of their mind. For instance, the narrative that Russia is a declining country and the narrative that Russia threatens the world. Now you can slot these forwards and backwards as you think fit. And I can think of other examples, but I'm sure your listeners can too. It's this capacity to appear to be sincere and yet to know one is peddling a false narrative. Now, Joe asked George the question in that interview, do you think people in the system know when they're peddling lies? And George answered to the effect of, no, I think most of them are sincere. And I think most of them are sincere, but they have this capacity for doublethink, to be saying one thing while knowing it's actually not true.
That would seem to be insincere to me. If they know that it's not true, I don't care what kind of mental gymnastics they're going through. They're not saying something they know is true. And why? Because they have mortgages to pay, children to put through university, et cetera, et cetera. You have a great line in your talk in Canberra on Thursday, Tony, when you say, quote, people who work or have worked close to government in departments, politics, armed forces, top universities, mostly accept whatever they understand at the time to be the government view of truth. So that's as far as they go. To answer that question that I put to Bebbe, that we're discussing now accurately, is almost impossible. You'd have to really question each individual person in government and in media, by the way, to see what they really think. I think there's probably a combination of true believers who really do believe it because they're naive to some extent, or because basically it's good for their own interests. And there may be the others who have to engage in this doublethink, and then there are those who are on the verge of becoming whistleblowers all the time and mostly don't because they can't take it anymore. So I think that this is such a crucial question that one has to continue to talk about, because until people within media, within government, step outside and have the courage to do that and face consequences, possible consequences, we are never going to break through what you wrote about here in Orwell, that his 2 books, Animal Farm in 1984, you say become our manuals that could be used today by governments in the principles of information warfare. You write, or you say that their plots tell of the creation by the state of false narratives with which to control their gullible populations. And until more people step out of their official positions, if they can no longer take this contradiction that they have between what they know is true and what they're being told to be false, that false narrative will continue to work. And it's so chilling, Tony, especially when you return back to the US to see how thoroughly believed this false narrative is. I mean, people in other parts of the world, almost everywhere else in the world, even over the border in Canada, you will see people have a better idea of what the United States is really up to in the world. And once you get here, people don't have a clue. They actually believe US spreading democracy and that Russia is the threat, even though it's US 30,000 NATO troops on the Russian border. It's the US that overthrew a government on Russian borders in Ukraine. It is the US that invaded Syria. And when you, and I want to ask you this, because you go into the beginning of your talk about the lead up to the tensions that we have between Russia and the US, and you talk about Syria, but you didn't mention that Putin, when he was at the UN in September of 2015, he made an extraordinary speech. It was the last time he appeared at the UN General Assembly. He's not coming again this month. He said that He invited the United States to join in a crusade against ISIS, similar to what the US and the Soviet Union did against the Nazis, and that they had to join together to crush this group. And then, of course, the US rejected that. And the press talked about immediately that this was a Russian imperial thrust into Syria to regain their imperial glory. And I found that such an extraordinary lack of self-introspection about who has the empire these days and what exactly Putin was offering the United States. And then, as you probably know, Tony, Obama tried later on to work with Russia against ISIS. And if you recall, Ash Carter made a mistake and they killed 65 Syrian Arab army troops, just as that deal between Kerry and Lavrov was going to be made to work together, and that destroyed that. I know I've said a lot here, but I just wanted you to give me your thoughts on some of this.
Well, a lot of thoughts on that. Number one, starting at the end, it wasn't necessarily a mistake that the 65 Russian troops were killed. That Obama basically was pursuing a two-faced policy. On the one hand, he was claiming to want to control ISIS. On the other hand, he knew very well that through Saudi Arabia and certain Gulf states, the United States weapons were flowing in massive quantities into ISIS. So basically backing both horses. Putin would not be so naive again as to appeal to the United States to join a crusade with him against terrorism. I think Putin now has pretty much given up on the United States, unfortunately. He's accepted that Russia has basically got to fight its own battles and find its own new alliances, which it's doing in Eurasia. Could the relationship with the United States ever be retrieved? I don't think so, not in a hurry, because the United States always has this hidden agenda to weaken Russia, because Russia is still the major nuclear threat to the United States. Although China's coming on fairly rapidly, I don't think China's going to militarize nuclear forces to the extent that Russia has. Russia still has a much weaker force than the US, but the important thing about it is it has an invulnerable second strike deterrent force, and there is nothing the US can do about that. There's no matter how many troops they put on the Russian border, no matter how many missiles they threaten the populated regions of European Russia with, from countries like Poland and Ukraine, Poland and Romania, and possibly in the future Ukraine, although I hope not. In the end, Russia can hit back and destroy the US if its national survival is threatened. Now, the important thing to know is that the Russians understand this. They know that they have to maintain second strike deterrence. They don't need convincing of it. Americans don't understand that this is happening. Americans somehow have somehow put the nuclear second strike deterrence situation out of their minds. They're pretending that because they have much larger defense forces in Russia, bases all around the world and so forth, that they are the stronger power, and that Russia is somehow a weak country that happens to have a lot of natural resources. Well, it may be true in one sense, but it's certainly not true in the sense of nuclear deterrence.
Sorry, a lot of resources that the United States would like to get their hands on. And I think that's what we saw in the Yeltsin years when Wall Street swooped in, made alliances with local oligarchs and asset stripped the country and carted out untold numbers of rubles and dollars out of the country and impoverished the Russian population. I first visited Moscow in 1995 in November, and I saw a devastating scene of camps of homeless people outside the train stations, building fires. People, I twice almost was robbed, and cops were stopping my cab drivers for bribes. It was chaos. And I went back exactly 20 years later in November of 2015. I saw a totally different place. I had just left Berlin, and it didn't seem much different from Berlin. It was a modern contemporary European city, well lit, clean, safe, functioning above all. And Americans wonder why Putin is popular in Russia. But my experience was nothing like yours. You went back after a much longer period. Give us what the contrast that you saw from 69, 71 to this decade when you returned.
Well, there's great pride now in Russia. People feel proud of their achievements. They're proud that they've done it by themselves. there is, I think, a rejection of the Western imperialist project, which those years that you remember, and George Beebe is very good on this too in his interview, like all great empires, they have their light side and their dark side. Yes, as George says, there are a lot of well-meaning, idealistic Americans who were setting up think tanks and institutes in Moscow and trying to help bring the Russians towards prosperity under the American aegis. But there were others, as you say, who were ripping off the country mercilessly, and there were Russian oligarchs who were prepared to work with them. Now, what Putin has done since 2002, he's cleaned all that out. What you might call the disloyal oligarchs have been removed. People like Berezovsky and Khovardovsky have left the country. The new oligarchs are more like American industrial barons, more like the Rockefellers. They are, yes, they're very greedy, they like to live well, but they are patriotic and they work with the government, close to the government. Now, there's a tradition going right back to the Tsarist days of industrial development through massive state-favoured enterprises. So the Tsars used to dole out the railway franchise, the water franchise, the electricity franchise to different favoured top families like the Rockefellers. And these great families developed Russia at a very rapid rate in the 19th century. Putin, in a way, is going back to that, but he is very conscious of the need for social balance and the need for safety valves. And he knows how to listen. So there's this old tradition in Russia of the Tsar listening to the people when the robber barons under the Tsar get out of control. It's a theme running right through Russian history. And Putin is very alert to that. I do not think that Putin is sitting there sending out murder squads around the world. I do not think that Putin is exercising a detailed malign control over the lives of 150 million Russians. I think he's a decent man, an honourable man, and he is doing his best to protect his country against the very considerable enemies that surround it. So whenever I go back to Russia, I feel a great sense of comfort and peace. I feel it's the civil society that works well. I could talk about Navalny's demonstrations if I wanted to, but they are very minor and they are very well behaved. They have a message. Yes, they want democracy to be improved. They don't want voting slates to be manipulated, but goodness me, look at the Democratic National Congress. Look at the way people like Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders are struggling to get a voice in that party at the moment. Every country has its shameful aspects of democracy. The important thing about Russia, I think, is that it's moving forward steadily. And every time I go back, it feels more normal, it feels more comfortable, it feels more civilized.
Shameful to hear in light of the way that the West is treating its dissidents and its dissenting voices. But that brings me to a question I wanted to ask about your talk, and that was that you mentioned Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning as victims to some extent of this increased tension between Russia and the West. And I wanted to ask you what you meant exactly by that, because I know that the Russiagate narrative has definitely tried to smear Assange as somehow a tool of Russia in publishing the Podesta and DNC emails. But, Chelsea Manning's leaks and the publications of WikiLeaks around, 2010, 2011, really didn't have much to do with Russia and weren't really part of this Russiagate scenario. So I wanted to get to understand and have you expand a little bit on that point.
I'm glad to, and it's important to do so. You're quite correct that Assange and Chelsea Manning are not, in my opinion, and not in the opinion of many reasonable observers, connected to Russia. Assange has always been specific on that point. But of course, the people whose minds have been taken over by the malign Russophobia narrative try desperately to link Assange and Chelsea Manning to Russia. I mean, they even try to link me to Russia. Just to be personal for a moment, I've been called a Putin puppet and a Kremlin stooge. I've been called naive, and I've been called open to exploitation by Russia. I reject all those accusations, and Assange and Chelsea Manning quite properly reject similar allegations against them. They have campaigned for freedom and the right of the public to know when their own government commits atrocities. And I'm very glad we know about what happened in Iraq under the US occupation. I'm very glad we know about what happens in Afghanistan and the continuing war there. And I think that the attempt to silence Assange and Manning is shameful. And it is done for one reason, two reasons. One, vindictiveness, it's simply a desire to punish someone who slapped the Imperium in the face. But more importantly, to deter others. They really want to send these two people to the lines in order to make it less likely that others will follow. But others are following. I mean, down here in Australia now, we've got a few very high-profile cases of people who have defied the secrecy of the state, where they felt that there were human rights and governance issues involved in basically making things public that needed to be made public. So, you're not going to stop freedom. You're not going to stop dissidents. Even in Australia, it's working.
Do you think that the Integrity Initiative and efforts like it have become more successful thanks to the silencing of people like Assange when he was removed from Twitter and ultimately, arrested and thrown into Belmarsh? Do you think that that's had a positive effect on those propaganda narratives, or do you think that they have been exposed to such an extent that it doesn't really affect them?
I feel great grief at what's happening to Julian, great grief. And I wish we could help save him. I don't know whether we can help save him. I think he continues to be a beacon and an example to people. So I don't think that the forces of truth and virtue have been set back by this.
Good. Do you think overall, because your discussion covers basically a broad bird's eye view of the entire tension and history of that tension between Russia and the West, specifically the US and the UK especially. Can you give a sense of where you think this is going? I doubt, just because the Integrity Initiative and other efforts like that have been exposed to the public, or albeit not covered much in mainstream media, obviously that isn't going to stop those efforts from continuing. Where do you see this going in the future, short term and long term?
It's a brave man who predicts the future. But let me say that I see some hope in the interest on the continent of Europe in achieving some sort of normalization of relations with Russia. The Baltic gas pipeline, despite huge American efforts to stop it, does seem to be approaching completion. And once that cheap Russian energy is flowing into Germany, there will then be a very massive economic link between Russia and Europe, which is very important. I think Macron understands this. There is, of course, the tendency to say, let's make friends with Russia and then use them against China. So there's always an ulterior motive. But the Russians are smart enough now not to fall for it. They will go into it with their eyes wide open. I think that the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries, America, Britain, Canada, Australia, to a lesser extent New Zealand, but those four certainly, will be the last to smell the coffee, because we are so under the thumb now of the Russophobic narrative that I think it's going to be a long time. I think that we haven't talked much about US internal politics, but I think that Trump has now come totally under the thumb of Mike Pompeo, representing the American deep state. Trump was really terrified when he saw what happened to him in the Helsinki summit, when he was basically the whole American media and power, they basically turned their back on him after he had that meeting with Putin, and he was isolated, friendless, terrified. He's now basically Pompeo's patsy. I'm sorry to say that, but there's not much he's going to be allowed to do without the deep state through Pompeo controlling it. James Mattis is gone. So many people are gone. people who were quite sensible. And I have a little bit in my talk where I run through the huge list of what I call casualties of Russophobia. Some of them might be bad guys. I don't think very highly of Paul Manafort, but a lot of them are not bad guys. I don't think Flynn was necessarily such a bad guy. He was a highly decorated general. He made a bureaucratic sort of mistake early in his tenure. He was mercilessly cut down and went to jail. And of course, Tillerson was treated badly. It's going to be quite hard for the forces of integrity and governance to regroup in Washington and London, because there are some very bad guys there. Now, it would be wonderful, for example, if against all the odds, Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister. I think that would be a huge plus. But we'll have to wait and see.
So you believe Trump is a Pompeo puppet, not a Putin puppet?
I do.
But
I think Pompeo is smart enough to cut him a bit of slack. I mean, Pompeo lets him have his frolics here and there. But, when the chips are down, the key decision points, the system takes control.
Well, you said there's a lot of bad, reasonable people left, but a very unreasonable one just left, John Bolton. And I think that speaks well for taking some of the pressure off Trump, certainly with Iran, where, by the way, Flynn was a big Islamophobe. He was perhaps reasonable on Russia and other issues, but certainly, and in the Middle East, on Syria. He was the one who revealed this Defense Intelligence Agency document that showed that was way back as August 2012, an analyst had predicted that there would be the rise of the Islamic State and that the U.S. and their allies in Turkey and the Gulf were supporting this effort to create a principality or principate in eastern Syria, which would later turn into Islamic State. And Flynn confirmed that was correct, and it was leaked, of course. It was actually released by a judge in a court case, that classified document. But when it comes to Bolton being gone, do you think that is helpful in any way towards relations with Russia? His main thing was North Korea and Iran, but he was no friend of Russia either.
Look, I'm delighted to see Bolton gone, as most people of goodwill are. He was a loathsome and dangerous man in that job. However, there's a Russian proverb or a Russian old folk tale. When you're in a sleigh and you're being pursued by a mob of hungry wolves, if you've got someone you're prepared to throw out, like a serf, that will decoy the wolves and hopefully you'll get away. I think that certain people thought that at this point Bolton might be expendable so that the wolves get distracted.
But the reins are still in Pompeo's hands, in your opinion?
I believe so, yes.
So was Trump sincere, in your opinion, looking back now over these years, in wanting better relations with Russia, and can he still win? He has not started a major war with anyone, by the way. It's the best thing to probably say about Trump. And he's pressing for better relations. He wants Russia back in the G7. And Macron did make that speech where he was saying that we better, whether that is to try to divide Russia and China, which is probably too late. I think they've been brought together too much by the U.S. since Ukraine and other instances of this anti-Russian fervor on the West. I don't think you can pry the two to get apart. But was Trump sincere about this, and can he follow through in the end in getting better relations with Russia, even with Pompeo on his back?
The answer to that is a very important question, and I think that it depends on whether Trump grows a pair, to be frank. He certainly has the presidential authority, but a president exercises power through his lieutenants. He says it shall be done, and it will be done, he hopes. He could still make a difference, but it will require a character and moral fibre on his part, which I haven't seen a great deal of it yet, but we remain hopeful. Certainly Russia, if it gets the chance to rejoin the G7 and make a G8, will take that chance because they're professionals. They know that any tool in diplomacy is worth using if it has prospect of success. Russia will never again fall for the Western trick of saying, be part of our club, and we will hold the rest of the world at bay. Russia will never fall for that again. And Russia, of course, has got its own experience of dealing with Islamic terrorism, its own experience of dealing with Central Asia, its former constituent Soviet republics. It's got massive expertise to draw on in dealing with China and Asia. And the prospects of a strong Eurasian economic community forming are very good. And it's happening very rapidly. We in the Anglosphere, we don't see how rapidly it's happening because our media don't bother reporting on it. Because our media really only report on Russia and increasingly China when there's a sting in the tail that they can put in the tail. That they are only interested in bad news. When there's good news, they simply spike it and it doesn't get beyond the wire services. A good example of that was the meeting just held in Vladivostok.
Right.
65 countries, about 3,000 participants, several prime ministers, the Prime Minister of India, of Malaysia, of Japan, and a great many representatives of all the other Asian countries were there with Putin to talk about Eurasian economic cooperation. It's happening very rapidly. And it's very important. One of my messages is it's very important for not just my country, Australia, but for the United States itself to get on board these initiatives. If the world divides into two opposing economic blocs, one based on the dollar and another one based on the Chinese and Russian currencies, it's not going to be good for the world economy, obviously, and it's not going to be good for world peace.
What did you see of that major conference in a Western newspaper, Tony?
Well, if you look it up in Google, you see it gets quite well reported in all the newspapers of India, Malaysia, Japan, and so on, workmanlike professional reporting. I couldn't see any Western reporting on it, Joe.
Isn't that
I certainly couldn't see any Australian reporting, but I couldn't see even in Bloomberg there wasn't much on it.
Isn't that something? When Putin makes a major speech, it's never reported. Because if they did report that, they wouldn't be able to get away with telling the American people and the European people what they think Russia's all about, rather than doing their jobs as reporters, reporting a speech objectively and just laying it out there. We need to know what Putin is saying. They don't want the American people to know what Putin is saying. And why? Because that narrative, that false narrative going back to Orwell that is created to control the population would start to chip away and fray and be undermined. And they can't have that. They can't have an honest intellectual inquiry in our societies. They need us to believe a certain narrative of how the world works. And it is completely false in the end of the day. It is delusional to the point where it's difficult to interact with American people here in the US on these issues. Can't talk to a handful of people that I know that I could speak with about these in rational terms. Otherwise, everyone else, it's impossible. You have to be dismissed.
Let me give you an anecdote here. When I started reading in what I hoped was a balanced, even-handed way a few years ago on these questions of major world politics, I initially had a sort of a frisson of fear every time I punched in the URL for stations like Sputnik or Russia Today or the Russian Foreign Ministry or TASS. I felt fear. I thought, gosh, I shouldn't really be doing this. In fact, I was just like Winston Smith, feeling guilty when he's in his flat. Gosh, I shouldn't be reading this forbidden book and having to hide it under the desk so the TV monitor couldn't see it. I mean, I know that everything I do on internet can be recorded by somebody. I know there are no secrets on internet. It took me quite a few weeks to get over my initial sense of fear at accessing the other side's websites. And all of those countries, not just Russia, but Germany, France, and so on, China, they all publish English language versions of their major news agency sites. So I can read TASS, Russia Today, Sputnik, Deutsche Welle, Xinhua. I can read them all in English. So there's no technical excuse not to access this sort of information. You just have to get over the initial fear of doing so.
And leading on from that, I'd like to ask you or invite you to kind of describe the censorship you've experienced, because you described it in your talk, but I'd like to have our audience understand what you've kind of been through since you've developed this view of Russia, especially since the publication of your book.
Well, I certainly haven't been sent to a gulag or to Guantanamo. I'm prosperous. I'm living comfortably as a retired man on a retired government pension. Having said that, about 3 months after my book was published, some very strange things started to happen. I was invited to speak at the Melbourne Writers' Festival, which is our largest writers' festival in Australia. I had a capacity ticketed audience of people interested to hear what I had to say, about 200 or 300 people. I was hoping to sell about 200 books in the usual sign and sell arrangement that they have at writers' festivals. Goodness me, every box of my books disappeared. They didn't turn up at the Writers' Festival. We never established why or how, but I suspect there were people in the distribution chain, and publishing and book promotion is heavily infected with people who sympathise with integrity initiative type viewpoints on Russia. I think the word went out, let's create a little bit of upstream interference for Tony Kevin, let's lose his books, and they got lost. This kind of stuff went on happening. I was scheduled to appear in a debate with a British academic on Russia-China relations, major debating forum. 2 weeks before it, long after the advertising had gone out, his organising company pulled him. They said, sorry, he's got another commitment. Debate fell down, didn't happen. The Australian Broadcasting Commission has pretty much stopped inviting me on screen to talk about foreign policy. I've stopped being invited to writers' festivals. I've received no book prizes for this book, no shortlisting, no longlisting, even though I'd won 3 book prizes for my previous books. So it sort of goes on. And I have this feeling that I've been, in a civilized but very effective way, pushed out of taking part in the national debate on foreign policy.
And while you may not be in a gulag and maybe your personal situation is not endangered, that's still an absence in the social discourse that is felt, that is real. I mean, the outlets that are American, Australian, writers like Caitlin Johnstone, all of them virtually experience some type of censorship or attack or smears. As an independent journalist myself, I've been smeared by Integrity Initiative tied individuals. Like, it is pervasive. Do you think that there's any chance that this will be fought back by people like Caitlin Johnstone becoming so popular? Do you think that's a successful fight that we're having at the moment?
Well, I have to believe that, and the fact that you've invited me onto your international program is proof that we are making headway. And what Caitlin does every week, she puts out an incredible essay or several essays that are pertinent and to the point and have an increasingly wide circulation, not only in Australia but around the world. Australians, of course, have a record of dissidence. I mean, not only Caitlin and Julian Assange, but going back to John Pilger and going back before him to Rupert Lockwood, all sorts of people. Australian journalists have been crusaders for truth, and I feel I'm in that tradition in a modest sort of way, and we will go on doing that.
Tony, I want to thank you for joining us on CN Live. We can go on for much longer talking about so many things. We didn't get onto the Skripals incident, which you mentioned last night, which was another part of what seems like to be this pretty much British-run campaign, but America's fallen in some ways, that has undermined the most important relationship in the world, probably the 2 most powerful nuclear weapon states that need to get along and cannot afford tensions, because that is the real basis of George Beebe's book, by the way, was the possibility of an accidental war between both countries. And I hope that the worst of the tension between Russia and the U.S. has passed us. So let's finish with a final question for you. Tony, is the worst behind us between Russia and the U.S.? And we came maybe close in Syria to some conflict. Are those days behind us, the possible accidental war?
I don't think the worst is behind us. No, I don't. I think, the war that could have happened in Syria after the Duma fake fake attack staged by the White Helmets could happen again after a fake attack that gets out of control in the Straits of Hormuz off the coast of Iran. I think that George Beebe said a very important thing, and I'm sure it's a major theme of his book, that the West is captive to this Munich appeasement meme in its thinking about Russia, that it somehow put Putin's Russia in the position of Hitler's Germany, and you can't appease, you have to fight back all the time. Whereas, as George said, that the better analogy is pre-1914 Europe. The risk of war breaking out by accident or misjudgment or miscalculation has pretty much happened the way World War I broke out. So I think that's a really important thought to leave you readers with, listeners with. I would say the Skripal's case is terribly important to read about because it is so obviously, transparently fake. And yet, double think again, people have been induced to believe it because, hello, the British bureaucracy cannot lie, allegedly. But of course it can lie, and it does with great alacrity. And I finally would like to suggest that I think you're putting my whole talk up on your consortium website. And
Already up on the site, that's right.
I'd urge people to read it. I think, as you say, it's a bit of a bird's eye view over the whole terrain of East-West relations, and it's quite a good introduction to a lot of more specific, closer focus reading. I am worried, and I hope that going on this program helps a little bit to strengthen the forces of good sense and moderation.
Well, we're really happy to have had you, as you're one of the minority, as we are, who do not buy the narrative that's being sold to us. And that makes it really hard to keep our wits about us sometimes, because we are in the minority, and they act by being the majority. They must be right because they sell more newspapers, they have a larger audience, they make more money, they control more, so they must be right. Well, of course, we know that that's not true at all. So we're going to continue going forward, if we can, with analyzing what that narrative is, how it's wrong, and what other facts they are omitting to create the false narrative that they have. And I really happy to have Tony on today from Canberra to give us his incredible insights into U.S.-Russian relations, Western-Russian relations, and his own personal experiences there. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Joe.
Слышны в саду даже шорохи, все здесь замерло до утра. Если б знали вы, как мне дороги подмосковные вечера. Если б знали вы, как мне дороги подмосковные вечера. Речка движется и не движется, вся из лунного серебра. Песня слышится и не слышится, в эти тихие вечера. Песня слышится и не слышится в эти тихие вечера. Что ж ты, милая, смотришь искоса, низко голову наклоня? Трудно высказать и не высказать все, что на сердце у меня. Трудно высказать и не высказать все, что на сердце у меня. А рассвет уже все заметнее. Так, пожалуйста, будь добра, не забудь и ты эти летние подмосковные вечера. Не забудь и ты эти летние подмосковные вечера.
Joining us from Russia is Mark Sleboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst based in Moscow. Mark, welcome to CN Live.
Joe, Elizabeth, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, thank you. Now, Mark, before I get into some of the details of what George Beebe said in his interview with us earlier, I'm curious about one point that he makes that really troubles me. And when he said that it's very difficult for U.S. security officials at a high level to put themselves in the shoes of other nations. He was talking about Vietnam. Certainly now we're talking about Russia. And, you know, sure, it's difficult, but it seems to me they're not even making the effort, but that they're even aware that they need to try to see the situation that they're in, sometimes a deadly situation, from the point of view of the other side, that they are either killing or about to kill. I mean, we're talking about the most serious situation possible in politics. And when I worked 25 years at the UN, you know, I was surrounded by representatives and journalists from 180 member countries, and it was imperative that you understood what they were talking to. So I talked to their journalists. I tried to see how they looked at the U.S. and certainly living abroad helped me to do that. But I thought that was something a diplomat and a journalist covering international affairs has to do. What did you make of that when he said that? Well, it's just too difficult.
It actually doesn't surprise me at all. And I say that because we've seen repeatedly for the last 30 plus years at least, we have seen a situation where the U.S. Primarily through its ideology of exceptionalism, and the European powers have come to believe in their own variety of Western exceptionalism and are now just as zealous about it. They believe in the universality and the moral superiority of their own culture and their own political system that prevents them from even asking the question of seeing through someone else's eyes or walking 10 paces in someone else's footsteps, because to do so would be a mark of moral degradation. It would be giving in to authoritarianism. It would be giving in to communism. It would be giving in to anything they identify as outside their own realm. And, this is nothing new. We have heard all of this before. Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations wrote, "In the emerging world of ethnic conflict and civilizational class, Western belief in the universality of Western culture suffers three problems. It is false, it is immoral, and it is dangerous." And he went on to say that cultural and civilizational diversity, we're talking multipolarism there, yes, challenges the Western and particularly American belief in the universal relevance of Western culture. Imperialism is the necessary logical consequence of universalism. And that takes us where we are today, with this situation where the U.S. is acting with such impunity around the world. And I speak with some little degree of authority there, because I am a U.S. military veteran. I spent 6 years in the Navy in the nuclear engineering field. And I have an inkling of what the U.S. is getting up to, all right, in the world and around the world. Just in the past few days, there is an interview out with Samantha Powers from the Obama administration, and they were questioning her about Libya and the failure of the Obama administration, they say, to understand the cultural particularities of the tribal nature of Libyan culture that led to once the U.S. removed the central government in Tripoli, led to the chaos and the complete dissolution of the state that we see today. And she says, well, how could we have been expected to understand their culture? And I'm paraphrasing her there, but if you don't understand another country's culture, what are you doing intervening in its affairs and changing its regime?
Mark, I want to spend a little more time on this because I think this is really the crux of the whole matter. She said you can't expect us to understand other cultures. Was that what I heard you say?
Yeah. I'm paraphrasing her, but that is what she said. And this has just come out. This is an interview she did in the last couple of days. It's in the mainstream media. This is remarkable from someone from her position. To have say that and to use it as a justification that the particularities of the tribal nature of Libyan culture, we could not possibly have understood that. It's a different culture.
It's such a supremacist point of view. It's as though our culture is so much superior to everyone else's that we don't need to bother. And they all want to be like us. And then we are helping them to transform themselves to be like us by bombing the hell out of them, killing their citizens, and removing governments that we think are not good for them, but are really not good for U.S. interests.
Yeah, Joe, what you don't understand is that deep down inside every yellow, black, and brown person in the world, there is a little American just waiting to get out, right? And you can't see that, but they can, right? And
paraphrasing,
you have to crack a few eggs to liberate the rest of the chickens, or something along those lines, right?
Laughing.
I think you use the exact word I use myself, and it has to be said every time we talk about exceptionalism. We have to point out that it is a supremacist ideology, and it is incredibly dangerous for that supremacism.
Without question. I think you may have been stealing that line from Carlos Fuentes, who said inside every ego is an Argentine wanting to get out. It is dangerous is the right word on a number of levels. And it also, if we're going to go back to some literary references, we should bring up Edward Said, because I think this is Orientalism to a T. It's the idea that we can explain their culture to themselves better than they themselves can understand it. And we don't need to listen to them because we already know what they're thinking and what they're saying and what's good for them. And there's a direct line from colonialism, which Said was writing about, to today. It has not been broken. Whether you roll down a flag in an African country and put up a national flag, the political and the particular economic control continued in many ways by the former colonial powers. And now the United States is employing the same mentality as we saw in 19th century European colonialism to the point of the torture. If you look at photographs of what Britain may have done in India or in Africa, or what the French did in Southeast Asia, the atrocities that took place, the photographs, the trophy pictures that were taken. We have the same from Iraq and Afghanistan, don't we, Mark? It's exactly the same. We like to think of ourselves as modern. We put all that behind us. That's another part of the myth. But it's a direct continuation of that. And the other danger, not only to the people of those other countries, is to the Americans themselves. And I see this when I return from living abroad, as I have several times for numerous years, or even on a long journey for more than 6 weeks outside the U.S. I come back here and I immediately notice the bubble that people are living in here. They haven't got a clue about how the rest of the world sees the U.S., about what the rest of the world is like, and they don't care. That's the more dangerous thing. For the average Americans who are imbibing in media that gives them this point of view, I suppose they can be given a pass. We can't expect working class people to be taking hours out of their day to try to really understand international affairs and not what the mainstream media is telling them. But for the political class, and particularly those in national security, it is, somebody like the man in the power, it is totally inexcusable, isn't it, Mark?
It is absolutely. Joe, how many times have you heard a U.S. government official or in the U.S. mainstream media, have you heard someone say that another government is not acting in the best interests of its citizens when it is in a conflict or disagreement situation with the U.S., i.e., the U.S. government, and not selfishly concerned about its own interests at all because it's such a benevolent hegemon, all right, knows what's better for the people of another country, even though it obviously, as Samantha Powers points out, they don't understand any other culture and they don't even try to understand it. The U.S. still knows better what is best for those people, and again, it goes back to this doctrine of exceptionalism, and it's far more than just international legal exceptionalism. The belief that international law, the UN Charter, should not tie the hands of the U.S. in doing its good work in the world, but it's actually about moral superiority as well.
So let's get on to what George Bebbe said, and there are worse, I think, people than he, because at least he sees some U.S. responsibility in all of this. And what we're talking about, of course, are U.S.-Russian relations, and his book is about the possibility of a war, even accidentally breaking out, in a disastrous, catastrophic one, of course. Mark, rather than asking you what you disagree with him about, is there anything you agreed with George Bebbe?
About 90% of what he said. I watched your interview. I actually regret. I think it would be wonderful to have a conversation with him, and if he's interested in having a debate further, I would love it. I agree with 90% of what he said during that debate, and he is, he's a vice president and a director of the Center for National Interest, the National Interest magazine. The National Interest is one of the better journals in the U.S. that writes about international relations. Just about the only better one that I know is the American Conservative, which is pretty much a must-read for anyone who has a non-intervention look at U.S. foreign policy. But the National Interest is very good too. They do print, they balance on both sides, but there's so few places in the U.S. media that you can read anything from such a political bent. And George Beebe is a realist, and that is something that is almost completely out of the halls of U.S. foreign policy formation, what they call the blob now, from Ben Rhodes' terminology, right? The foggy bottom, the State Department, and the other people both within and outside the government that formulate U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. foreign policy elite. It is entirely dominated by liberalism, and by that I mean specifically the international relations theory of liberalism, vice realism. It is a praxis ideology that we make the world that we want to see, and also we see the world that we want it to be, rather than the realist world that we deal with the world as it is and don't necessarily recognize some ideological belief in moral superiority that puts us above the rest of the players. And it is that dearth of realists for decades now in U.S. foreign policy, and I think you have to talk to security service as well, elite, that has brought us, to this situation where we've seen, regime change after regime change, meddling after meddling, intervention after intervention for so many years now. And George Beebe is one of those. I think he was probably a closet realist. I very much like to question him about exactly, I don't know if he could answer, what he was doing during some of these crisis moments that led to the escalation with Russia that we're seeing now. But I kind of got the sense that there's a little bit of regret and guilt that is driving his viewpoint now. And he did very carefully parse his words, but I was really impressed with what he had to say. And there really very little, except a few characterizations on the nature of the Russian government, which even then he was careful to speak in other people's words when he was characterizing it. This is what they think, not necessarily what he thinks. And I would put his book, The Russia Trap, up there with a whole series of realist manifestos that have come out. John Mearsheimer's The Great Delusion, Stephen Walt's The Hell of Good Intentions, Richard Sakwa's Ukraine Frontline, Crisis in the Borderlands. These are all real important realist books that are starting to more vocally question this liberal domination of U.S. foreign policy, that has ruled supreme for the last 30 years.
Yeah, returning to the discussion that you, Mark, and Joe were having a moment ago, I'd like to add that it seems, and please, expand on this, disagree with this if you like, but it seems to me that in addition to the fact of the kind of neocolonial view that we're talking about in this subject, it also seems that colonial view to begin with is sort of driven by this sociopathic or psychopathic lack of empathy that then prompts that statement that, well, it's hard work to understand somebody else, or it's hard work to have empathy, when you're supposed to be a diplomat, and that's basically your job, as Joe mentioned in the interview with George. I think that that is something that journalists like Caitlin Johnstone have talked about a lot, the way that, the power consolidation, the way the structures of power are created in order to basically accidentally encourage that type of personality to rise to positions of great influence. I just wanted to get your take on that and how much that impacts not only what George had to say to us, but also the situation in general with Russia and other situations in foreign policy.
I think it goes a degree further that it's not just that they feel that it's hard, right? To put it, it's that they come from a position of moral superiority where to even try that would be morally wrong. That it would be a moral fault to try to put yourself in their shoes because they are wrong. They are morally wrong. They are civilizationally, societally wrong. And so to try to put yourself as a U.S. government official in their shoes would be a type of apologism. And we've seen how anyone who questions that is or who tries to do that is called out now. In not just in the media, but by U.S. politicians, European politicians. It's become quite prevalent now that if anyone tries to even this is the Russian point of view, then you're a Russian apologist, and anything you have to say has no value. And specifically with Russia, I mean, the big crisis point now in Russia Western relations is, of course, the started with the events of 2014 with the openly West-backed putsch that violently and unconstitutionally overthrew a flawed but democratically elected Ukrainian government that had dared to say no to the EU neoliberal shock therapy diktat that was their EU association agreement. The EU had no problem at all working with Yanukovych up until he said at the end, when he saw the final document, and he realized that there was going to be no large sum of money of aid that was supposed to ameliorate the effects of this neoliberal shock therapy, which called for privatizing the entire Ukrainian state-centric economy, would have resulted in probably not just millions, but over 10 million unemployed people in the country. It would have been economic, chaos and devastation like Russia experienced in the 90s, and it would have been political suicide for anyone to do so. And the EU had recognized the election of Yanukovych as the fairest election that Ukraine had had since its independence. They were saying that they were all too glad to work with him again up until he said no, and then it was okay, you're out of there. On the other side, one of the three big leaders of the Maidan, the political leaders that at least it was presented in the Western media, was Oleg Tyahnybok. And the man is a Banderite fascist, an ultra-nationalist. He was the leader, the co-founder of the Sleboda party, which was previously known as the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine. It was an open neo-Nazi party. He was the co-founder, along with Andrei Parubi, who was the leader of the so-called self-defense battalions of the Maidan, and then became the speaker of the new Putsch Rada, and he was only recently removed from that position when the new president Zelensky took office. He's still in the Rada, but he's no longer the speaker. The EU specifically condemned in a resolution that no one should work with the Sleboda party because it was xenophobic, it was anti-Semitic, it was ultra-nationalist, all the things they condemned. They said anyone who is interested in democracy in Ukraine should not work or talk with this party and its people. And then less than 2 years later, a year and a half later, we saw Catherine Ashton, the foreign policy chief of the EU, along, of course, with Victoria Nuland and John McCain, all doing photo ops on the stage of the Maidan with their arms around this very same Oleg Tyahnybok. And again, is it because that they would like someone like that to come to power in their own country, that they agree with them? No, it's pure utilitarianism. He's the tool for the job. That was best suited, him and others like him, they wanted the government that was not playing by the script they had written of Ukraine joining the EU and eventually NATO, and they removed him, and they used what tools? Here it was liberal peaceful protesters supplemented by ultra-nationalist violent battalions that did the fighting on the street and the seizing of government buildings, and then pursued the war in the east and the rest of the country to subjugate the rest of the country, the east, the Donbass, to the seizure of power in Kiev. And I think George Beebe fully understands that that's what happened in Ukraine, but he may even regret it to a certain extent. But he can't quite put it in those terms as I've put them now. And I want to say full disclosure, I do have a vested interest. My wife is Crimean. My wife is from the Crimea in Ukraine. My in-laws still live in Simferopol. And we have family all there and all over East Ukraine, in Donbass and Kharkov and Odessa. And, the people who have no agency, it's all Russian invaders and so on. And George Beebe carefully assessed it, right? Russia did intervene after the openly U.S.-backed putsch in eastern Ukraine. There was not a military invasion, certainly not why it's talked about in the Western press. It did provide military aid. it provided advisors, and there was more than likely some special forces, and there were definitely trainers on the ground there. But what he's not going to admit is that's exactly what NATO was doing on the side of the regime, of the putsch forces that they had just brought to power. That NATO was training them, that it had advisors, that it was providing them military aid, that it was, propping up the new regime with tens of billions of dollars of IMF money, which of course comes from Western taxpayers, even if it's not drawn directly from their own budgets. And Russia actually, in their intervention, they were very careful to let the forces of East Ukraine take only so much and no more. They actually could have taken far more. They could have driven to Dnieper, to the river dividing East and Western Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk. They might have even been able to go all the way to Kiev, but Russia was actually signaling to the West that we are only responding to these events that you have helped instigate in Kiev. We are not after larger territorial occupation or annexation of more than Ukraine. The Crimea was an exception because of Russia's naval influence there, because over 95% of the population there voted in the referendum for it. They have an ethnic Russian majority, and whereas in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, it probably would have fallen more on the side of like 75, 80. It just wasn't quite as sure a thing. All this Russian signaling was, of course, ignored, because to acknowledge it would have meant to acknowledge the very real and overt meddling and to the, it wasn't just meddling, it was hybrid warfare role that the U.S. and other European countries had in overthrowing the Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych in Kiev. And, it wasn't just, handing out cookies, right? It went quite a few steps beyond that. All of these organizations that were, involved were funded, once again, through the National Endowment for Democracy, through George Soros's Open Society Foundation. Pierre Omidyar, another oligarch, the one behind The Intercept, was intimately involved there. Just one example, Hromadske, which was a media outlet, a startup media outlet that started right when the Maidan was kicking off in November of 2013 as the protest began. Hromadske was the primary organizing and InfoWar outlet of the Maidan. In fact, many of its most prominent people, right, pro-Maidan, have admitted that if it wasn't for Hromadske, the Maidan never would have been successful. And the Maidan, Hromadske, as its constant 24-hour tagline across the screen, had revolution, right? Who started up and funded Hromadske? They're quite open about it. It was the U.S. and the Dutch embassies in Ukraine. They provided the money, they provided the equipment, they provided the training, right? They're quite proud of that. They don't hide it. It's the information is out there, written by them, published in the media, and that is just one of the most glaring, obvious examples where they're not even afraid to admit what they did. Now, could you imagine if that was the case? If Russia was openly funding a media outlet, calling for the overthrow of a Western government, that of course wouldn't at all be allowed. Russia definitely made mistakes in Ukraine following that. Primarily, I think they should have been far more militarily active than they were. They should have not accepted the new regime at all, and its Nazi neo-Nazi, official state glorification of Nazi collaborators and Holocaust perpetrators that are now educating children in schools in Ukraine through the Azov Battalion and others. The declaration of people like Stefan Bandera and the leaders of the OUN and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Nazi collaborators from World War II. They've declared them the founding fathers of Ukraine, and that to question, they installed a law in the books that even if you're like a historian who questions that they are the unquestionable and unassailable founding fathers, it can mean fines and prison.
Yeah, somehow that doesn't surprise me, given the recent buzz about the Pentagon interfering in disinformation in the U.S. But I have one more question I'd like to ask you about the way in which Beebe basically, was critical of aspects of Russiagate that involved collusion, but basically was, kind of bought or supported the idea that the DNC had been hacked by Russians, and he kind of described his opinion briefly on that. I just wanted to get your take on that, what you thought of it. Anything you agreed with, disagreed with, that type of thing.
Okay, I want to say that this is just my personal opinion based on the evidence I've seen and what I understand here. I believe that the Russian intelligence services, probably did hack the Democratic National Committee. And when I say that, they had access to the Democratic National Committee. According to some sources that saw the initial CrowdStrike report, there were multiple foreign entities that had hacked the DNC database, right? Foreign, domestic, so on. They never issued a final report. The servers were refused to turn over to the FBI. The servers were then destroyed. CrowdStrike never issued a final report, and so on. But I think it is more than likely that Russia did hack the DNC servers. But that does not mean that they were the ones responsible for handing over Clinton's emails, Clinton Panetta's and so on, to WikiLeaks. And, to stress, why I believe that's so and that one doesn't necessarily lead to the other, I want to quote Michael Hayden, who was the former U.S. intelligence chief. He was at different times head of both the CIA and the NSA, the National Security Agency. And an interview on the subject to the Heritage Foundation, and this was 2016, he said, "I have to admit my definition of what the Russians did at the DNC is unfortunately honorable state espionage. A foreign intelligence service getting the internal emails of a major political party and a major foreign adversary, game on. That's what we do." He continued, "By the way, I would not want to be in an American court of law and be forced to deny that I never did anything like that as director of the NSA, because I could not." I think that kind of explains that when Russia does take some actions like having access to the server, that is the rules of the game. That is what all major great powers do with each other now, because we live in a world of great power competition. And James Clapper, he was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then he was Obama's director of national intelligence. In an interview on ABC, he pointed out that cyber warfare is not terribly different than went on during the heyday of the Cold War, just with different tools and a different modality. And that he said the U.S. intelligence community is now at war with Russia, conducting operations, meaning cyber warfare operations, every hour of every day against Russia and other adversaries. All right. So, I mean, if you read the mainstream media, you have the perception that Russia is some aggressive intelligence and cyber warfare power out there. And it actually couldn't be more from the proof. They're playing by the rules of the game, such as they are, that have been established by the United States, and they are a late adopter and a very reactive player in all of this. I mean, Russians don't forget the cover of Time magazine in the 1990s, where Yanks rescue Russia, rescue Yeltsin, when Clinton administration openly provided money for, we've heard the internal communications now between Clinton and Yeltsin. The degree of meddling is just so beyond what they even think of as this Russiagate hysteria, even if you believe the worst of it. And they feel good about it. There was a movie about it.
It's that ideology of we can do whatever we want, but how dare you do even a shadow of that to us? That type
they did it, of course, in the best interests of Russia. It was in the best interests of Russia to have a drunken kleptocrat whose family of oligarchs looted $10 trillion in capital flight out of the country, and seeded the world for over a decade, to the U.S. unipolar moment. That was in the Russian people's interests. They would have you believe.
You're not saying, Mark, that Yeltsin's family did the 10 trillion. That was the total.
The term "the family" is a term that is used to mean. I mean, some people of his family actually were involved, but the term actually means the group of oligarchs, including Berezovsky and others around Yeltsin, that were affecting control of the country at the time.
I see. Okay, something like a mafia family. I want to move back to Ukraine, but before that, just what I said to George Beebe was, it doesn't matter if Russia hacked, and you're absolutely right. So many countries probably did.
I caught that in your first interview, and I just want to say that the U.S. believes what it does in its constant meddling, and we've had researchers from Carnegie Mellon who have documented the number of times, just up to 2000, that the U.S. has meddled just in foreign elections, right? Since the end of the Cold War, 80 sometimes, not counting regime changes, not counting, invasions and so on, covert operations, just the political meddling in elections. And that's only up to 2000. They've gone into hyperdrive since then. So the U.S. does this meddling routinely, and they do it in the name of democratization. Whether the people that revealed Clinton's emails and the collusion that was the real collusion of that 2016 campaign, which was the rigging of the DNC primary, part of the U.S. presidential election, by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC under Debbie Wasserman Schultz, revealing that email, whether it was as is premised, the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, for some reason, and not, I don't know why it would be the military intelligence getting involved and not the FSB or the SVR or so on, but whether it was them or whether it was an internal whistleblower, as Julian Assange has asserted again and again, you were democratized. Could there be any greater act of real democratization than informing the U.S. public that the Democratic primary is a rigged game? And unfortunately, it continues. There's been no correction about it to this day. The U.S. people, whoever is responsible, the information is factual, and they should be thankful for the democratization that they preach to others that they received.
Exactly. The information was true, so it was not sabotage. It was democratization, I guess you could say, as you just did. It was not an attempt to sabotage an election. That would have been spreading disinformation. That's law. So it doesn't matter if Russia hacked. It doesn't matter, in my view, if Russia gave the emails to WikiLeaks. There also could have been an internal whistleblower who leaked it, and there were hacking, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were friendly American countries to America, like Israel, France, or Britain, that also hacked those emails. So that is, I think it's really, it's still the only thing left in this whole collusion, obstructive justice, hacking narrative that we suffered for 3 years is the Russians did it still. And they're going to milk that in the 2020 election without any doubt in my mind. But I want to get into back to Ukraine for a second, because you said a number of things there. One, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's another thing. People persist that Russia was behind the leaking to WikiLeaks of this, and people will persist to believe that Russia invaded Ukraine, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And because the way the media, of course, reported it. I'll give you one example that I remember. That's one time Putin said, if I wanted to, I could have taken Kiev in 3 days. So how was that report? I remember the headline in The Guardian. I can take Ukraine in 3 days, or I will take Ukraine. So they cut out the context of what he said and made it sound like he was threatening to do that, rather than saying I didn't invade, because if I wanted to, I could easily have done that. And those kinds of things we are going to be suffering with for a long time about any understanding of Ukraine. But I want to get to some current issues about it, because there's not been the same amount of Western reporting on the Ukrainian situation as there was previously. A lot of it is shrouded in some mystery. Two things I want to ask you about. Number one, the $250 million in hardware and weapons that the U.S. is supposed to be given to Ukraine. You recall during the convention, the Republican convention, one of the scandals was that on the platform they said they were not going to arm the Ukrainian government, which of course was the Obama administration's position. There was nothing scandalous in that at all. They tried to make that into something that somehow Putin had that over Trump and got him to say he wouldn't send the money. But now there's this $250 million mark, and I just have read that Trump may not send it, but that Congress might authorize it anyway to the Pentagon to send over his objection. What's the latest on this, and how important would that be to events on the ground right now? So give us a little view of that as well.
Okay, well, first of all, it's not just it's an additional 250. Additional, because the Trump administration has already delivered, hundreds of millions of dollars in lethal military aid to the regime in Kiev. And let's be clear, that military aid is not being used to kill Russians. It's being used to kill other Ukrainians. There are some 13,000 plus Ukrainian lives that have been lost by 2014. And it's Ukrainians killing other Ukrainians. It's Ukrainians who support the Putsch regime in Kiev, those forces, killing and being killed by the people of East Ukraine who never acceded to and have never accepted that seizure of power, unconstitutional, illegal, and, overthrowing the government that the people of East Ukraine, East and South Ukraine, Crimea then part of it, overwhelmingly elected to represent them to Kiev. And, there's a lot of talk that it was a popular revolution. It was a revolution of dignity, right? As if only one side in this, of course, has dignity. And it's, of course, orthodoxy that you don't acknowledge that the people of Eastern Ukraine have any agency. It's just Russian invasion, Russian doing this. It has nothing to do with the people of East Ukraine never accepting the overthrow of the government that they elected to Kiev to lead the country. And, the shattering of the social contract and the Ukrainian constitution, that entailed, in the war against them as these Banderite battalions were empowered and integrated into the police and military structures and so forth. That money will be used for Ukrainians to kill other Ukrainians. That is, in the terms that the U.S. discusses Syria, it is, the leader in Kiev is murdering his own people, because that is, of course, the reality, and it is a new leader there, and Zelensky is not Poroshenko, but he is continuing his policies in that regard. This $250 million, again, Obama never actually delivered military aid to Ukraine, not lethal military aid. That is the Trump administration. It's on hold. I do think there is a bit of a push now to try to do some basic things to start the beginnings of a dialogue again with Russia. In recent days, we've seen some of that out of Macron and so on. And of course, it's 10 days late and 10 gazillion rubles short at this point. But they're aware that this $250 million that would not change the military calculus, the balance of power in Ukraine or on the front line there at all, because of course, Russia would immediately provide to the people of East Ukraine they've always been very careful about this, to provide exactly what the people of East Ukraine need to balance out what the West is providing to the regime in Kiev. That has always been, a very careful and limited Russian response there. And I have family there. The people in East Ukraine are extremely upset with Putin, with the Kremlin, because they don't think that he's done enough for them. They wish that he had invaded East Ukraine. They wanted direct military intervention. They don't want to be part of Ukraine again. They're actually upset that Putin is dead set, the Kremlin in general is dead set on pushing East Ukraine back into that Banderite madhouse, that Kiev has become. According to the Minsk protocols, which have been completely tossed to the side by Kiev and Germany and France, with limited federal powers to help protect, basically the political parties. Because one of the things that they don't talk about in Ukraine is that since this new government has taken power, all left parties in the country, the communists, which were one of the major political parties in Ukraine before all of this, and two other leftist parties, they've been banned. They're not I don't know what's democratic about that. They're not allowed to participate in the political process. The Party of Regions, the party that had won the last election, they were lustrated, right? The people who served in the administration never allowed again to serve in political office in the country. And there was a very literal pogrom, beatings, houses being burned, of any type of opposition powers to the new regime. And if East Ukraine was just handed over to Kiev again, that is the fate that would befall tens of thousands of people, right? They would end up, as Human Rights Watch noted, in Ukrainian intelligence SBU torture cells, where they kidnap and torture and disappear people regularly in Ukraine for having Maidan, new regime sentiments. That is what would befall the people of East Ukraine. But the Russian government, at least now, is not going to let that happen without some limited federal powers to protect them, because obviously the previous Ukrainian constitution, it shattered, the social contract broken, did not protect them.
Things are so upside down. Things are so upside down, Mark, that one could really argue that the people in the east of Ukraine who did not accept this coup are pro-democracy fighters. That we would never see that portrayed that way in the U.S. Also, just to add one thing about the myth of the Russian invasion, the German BND service gave documents and proof to Der Spiegel that General Breedlove, who headed NATO at that time in 2014, had completely lied about 40,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. It was a complete fabrication. I don't remember seeing that in the Western press at all. What is there a chance of you said that Russia is giving just the same amount of money to keep this war going. That is a dangerous situation in terms of the loss of life and the lack of progress. Is there a chance at all of a negotiated settlement? Is a prisoner exchange being discussed? Are we just going to be stuck with this low-level conflict for years?
Yeah, I unfortunately, I've seen the recent gestures. I actually read your article talking about Macron's gestures and so on.
Yeah.
But there's no question that the prisoner exchange is a good thing. There was a Eastern Ukrainian journalist, a dual citizen, who was the head of RIA Novosti. He was Kirill Vyshinsky. He was a political prisoner in Kiev. Simply for treason, for being critical of the new government. Of the new regime and how it took power. And he was one of the people that was gone back. In fact, most of the people that Russia recovered were not Russians. they were people, they were Ukrainian citizens. They were largely people from Eastern Ukraine that were, seized by the government in Kiev and held as political prisoners. That is the reality. It was Ukrainians that traded mostly for other Ukrainians. I'm not optimistic at the moment that that's going to go anywhere. The new president, this comedian actor, become president, and unfortunately he's most likely directly in the pocket of the oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, who owns among many other things, the television station that owns and created the television show where Zelensky's fictional character accidentally became president, which led to him actually becoming president in the real world. And Igor Kolomoisky, despite being Jewish and a dual citizen of Israel, was the first one, in the initial days after the Maidan, to fund and arm some of these very, dangerous and murderous neo-Nazi battalions, these Banderite fascists like Azov. They were funded by a Jewish oligarch, and he's the one that most people has agreed to some level or another is behind Zelensky. Zelensky refuses still to meet with the leaders of Eastern Ukraine, of the republics of the Donbass, of Donetsk and Lugansk. He refuses to meet with them. He refuses to talk to them, and that is the most basic first step requirements of the Minsk protocols, which have a very specific order that it was agreed that they would be followed in, and there have been zero steps towards completion of that. And again, the Ukrainian regime in Kiev has long tossed that to the side, and everything that Zelensky has said has indicated that he has no intention of reviving it, and he refuses to meet with Putin unless the leaders of France, Germany, the UK, and the US are in the room to hold his hand and babysit him while he discusses, this settlement, which is still a Ukrainian civil conflict with NATO entering and backing one side and Russia entering and backing the other. And also as a holdover from the Poroshenko government, the Interior Minister, Arsen Avakov. Avakov is the one who was responsible as the Interior Ministry for arming and funding all of these battalions. Azov, the neo-Nazi C-14, the 14 words of white nationalism, the right sector and others. And he was the one responsible. He is the one who integrated them into the police and military structures in Ukraine, creating, them joining and also creating parallel police institutional, the National Guard, and so on. And they remain there to this day. And Zelensky has not challenged them at all. And he kept Avakov on. And Avakov did not act during the election. And he actually, it was commonly spoken about by the pro-U.S. media, like the Kiev Post in Ukraine at the time, the U.S.-run media, that Volkov had cut a deal with Zelensky, and that deal appears to remain in this time. And until the Ukrainian president is willing to talk to the leaders in Donbass, right, and come to some type of political reconciliation to put back together this shattered country, some new constitutional framework where the old one was ripped apart, and is willing to take on these Banderite fascist ultranationalist battalions that have been so empowered in the country since then, and separate them from the police and military structures, then there's no real hope. Right? The prisoner exchange is a nice gesture. Zelensky promised it. It's defending his political promises to the country, that helped him get elected. But I don't see that in and of itself alone leading to any greater reconciliation in Ukraine or between Kiev and Moscow. until these other things that I've talked about, which are far more important, we begin to see some movement on them. And I've seen movement in the opposite direction.
I'd like to jump in and just ask you, or ask you to observe with me the fact that, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Venezuela or other places around the globe, what we're seeing in the examples that you've given us is that Trump has escalated policies and positions that were held by the Obama administration. And can you discuss that fact and the way in which that shows us that while, maybe the left is, screams and rants and raves about Trump, and the right screams and ranted and raved about Obama, that they ultimately in so many ways are so similar, and Trump seems to be not only continuing Obama policies, but actually, as you said just previously, escalating those policies.
Yeah, he has been, of course. And Obama, I still regard as principally responsible for what happened in Libya and Syria and in Ukraine. But Trump has continued and has indeed exacerbated, despite coming, running a campaign where he did have the most consistent foreign policy platform he has had during the campaign was ending the regime change wars, right, and improving relations with Russia. And instead, the exact opposite has happened. And a great deal of that is due to the neocon capture of the administration. And I believe that was probably part of some larger political deal where Trump agrees to bring the neocons in and run his foreign and military policy, and in return, the neocons and the Senate don't side with the Democrats in impeaching him. I believe there was some intrinsic deal there. Trump may have a little bit more room for maneuver now. I don't necessarily trust him on anything anymore, whether it's because he agrees with whoever was the last one in the room for 15 minutes who made a good argument, and he vacillates like that and has no real opinion of his own, or whether he's just politically weak, or whether he agrees with him wholeheartedly. It doesn't make any difference to Russia because and the people in Ukraine and Syria and Venezuela and so on, because that's what's happening. I mean, I'm glad to see John Bolton going too. But we have to remember that Trump hired John Bolton in the first place.
Elliot Abrams, on and on, yeah.
On and on, right? Elliot Abrams is still there. Mike Pompeo is still there. All of John Bolton's staff is still there. I mean, they're filled through, including, of course, at the Russia desk, as in both the State Department and in the intelligence services to begin with. So, he continued Obama's policies and made them worse. And, at the end of the day, we can only hold him responsible, as the commander in chief, again, whether it's through weakness or agreement or whatever. They used to talk about Kremlinology. This is, White Houseology. But it doesn't make any difference from the view of foreign countries like China, like Russia, like Venezuela, like Syria, looking in and dealing with the White House.
Mark, you mentioned Syria. I want to briefly, if you can, give us an update what's going on there. We saw particularly when Aleppo was liberated, and other areas in Aleppo province and elsewhere, that jihadists were being assembled and put on buses with their families and sent to Idlib. So you knew that there was going to be a reckoning one day in Idlib, because they'd concentrated them there, maybe, so that it would be easier to try to defeat them. We seem to be at that moment now. There's been a 2-week ceasefire that has come to an end, it seems. And the Syrian Arab Army has begun, again, attacks in Idlib. What is Russia doing there? And Syria and Ukraine were the two really main flashpoints of a possible conflict between the United States and Russia, which is the subject, really, of George Beebe's book. And many people feared that Clinton would have been more disastrous in that regard if she instituted a no-fly zone, for example. You do, okay. Trump has not started that larger war, fortunately, but we're not out of the woods yet, are we? Is Ukraine, and then is Syria still a flashpoint in any way? And please give us your update on what's happening in Idlib, and also, of course, Turkey's main role there and its relations with Russia and the U.S. I know that's a lot, but if you can briefly bring us up to speed on these issues.
Yeah, sure. Of course, Syria is still a flashpoint, not only because the U.S. is literally militarily invaded and occupies East Syria, where all the oil is, and created this proxy forces and a government there centered around the Kurds who have once again somehow, I don't know how they haven't learned the lesson. Maybe these are Syrian Kurds, not Iraqi Kurds, but become useful idiots of U.S. Hegemonic interests in Syria, and the U.S. isn't going anywhere at the moment. I mean, they're setting up a society and government in eastern Ukraine, and in Syria. And Syria today is still and has been for the last year plus. It's a three-way Mexican standoff. On one side, you have the Syrian government with its allies, Russia, Iran, actually the Iraqi government to some degree, and Hezbollah. On one side, that they control the majority of territory and the vast majority of the population of the country. The United States and its Kurdish proxies control the east of the country, which is sparsely populated desert, but is also where all the oil is. And in the north, you have the Turkish invasion and occupation that stretches from the previous Kurdish enclave of Afrin, which has now been essentially ethnically cleansed of the Kurds, all the way to the Jarablus corridor above Aleppo. That is an official zone of Turkish military occupation, and they've created a uniform jihadi proxy force, the National Liberation Force. And adjacent to that is this mountainous territory along the Turkish-Syrian border of Idlib, which is, everyone agrees, at some level, they've all admitted that it is controlled by Al-Qaeda, right? In its current moniker as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but even the U.S. government admits that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is Al-Qaeda, and its allies are the Turkestan Islamic Party. Syrian rebels? Much? No, they're Uyghurs and Turkmen, from across the greater Middle East. You have Haras al-Din, which the U.S. also just recognized a terrorist organization. They're in control of Idlib, and they are directly supported by the Erdogan regime in Turkey. Every day there are convoys of oil and food and supplies and ammunition and arms and artillery pieces, including, ironically enough, artillery pieces that Russia has previously sold to Turkey, that are going in and helping Al-Qaeda defend Idlib at this point. And Putin and Rouhani from Iran have been involved in this Astana framework with Turkey, with Erdogan. Is kind of a complicated geopolitical waltz with daggers poised at each other's back. They actually have good relations, economic relations, and so on, except when it comes to Syria, when they're still at war. And lately, the Russian government supporting the Syrian government with airstrikes and special forces and so on has been starting to liberate Idlib from this Turkish-backed Al-Qaeda at this point. The agreement had been that Turkey would basically disarm the worst elements, absorb them all into its proxy force, and then start some type of political reconciliation, basically getting Al-Qaeda and all of its friends to shave off their Wahhabi beards, put on Turkish proxy uniforms, and that would be the political reconciliation that Damascus would have to deal with. But Erdogan never went that far. He allowed Al-Qaeda, or at least didn't try to stop them, and then supplied them from taking all over Idlib. And Russia has had enough of enough. Turkey has had time and time again to separate the good jihadis from the bad jihadis, and hasn't accomplished it. And now that Turkey is in a politically hard position with the U.S. as it conflicts over the Turkish U.S. occupied Syrian border in the east over the Kurds, and these deals with the Russian S-400, which Putin has skillfully played to divide Turkey from the U.S. and the rest of NATO. Turkey's in a very bad position with the U.S. and doesn't have any leverage against Russia, and has been kind of backing off Syrian and Russian advances to take at least the southern portion of Idlib at this point, form a cauldron, and take it back. And the real area of interest for the Syrian government at this point is the M4, M5 highways, which will connect Aleppo to Damascus through Idlib rather than going all the way around through the desert, which is an economically unviable route. And restoring those highways is essential to the Syrian economy, which is being oil starved by the U.S. At this point and is in dire condition. They can't begin rebuilding and restoring stability to their country until they can get the basics of an economy working again. And those two highways are one important piece of that puzzle.
So if they could take those highways and hold them, we could look at a low-intensity conflict in the north, further north in Idlib, and let the Turkish-backed jihadists remain there and not be a threat? Could they be contained, or does this have to come?
No. In Idlib, I mean, there's no containing Al-Qaeda. Every time they've said this, they've declared ceasefires, with Turkish proxy forces. Al-Qaeda, of course, is never a party to them and continues attacks, unreported in the Western press, every day to the west into Latakia and the south into Hama and Homs. To the east into Aleppo province. They continue. You can't just let them go, and it is really impossible to hold the entirety of the M4, M5 highways without driving all of these Al-Qaeda and these other jihadists back into Turkey. And this puts Turkey in a very delicate position, of course, because if it abandons them, it's now opening itself to them taking the terrorism to Turkey, feeling that Erdogan has betrayed them, and bringing the violence, blowback style home to Turkey.
That happened already with ISIS, didn't it? When they started blowing stuff up.
Yeah, it did on a minor level happen with ISIS because the degree of Turkish cooperation, it was definitely there, but it was much less than what has happened with these forces there. And there's still this whole area of Turkish occupation, this Afrin to Jarablus corridor adjacent to Idlib. And the Turkish government is setting up schools, Turkish government post offices, clearly labeled and so on. They have no intention of leaving.
So, but as far as U.S.-Russian relations in Syria, the deconfliction and all of that stuff is still happening, and they're not going to get in each other's way, even though different interests clearly.
Syria is become another frozen conflict, like Ukraine is. In fact, I think what the U.S. has done said, "Oh, you're going to separate East Ukraine and prevent us from overtaking the whole country. We will do the same thing to you in Syria." And that's what they've done with an actual direct military occupation and the setup of a proxy government in eastern Syria. The U.S. and Russia have, give them credit, avoided somehow direct military conflict. They've been very careful about that in Syria. There's one incident where somewhere between 12 and 200 Russian security contractors were killed by the U.S. government, but unfortunately, to their families, the Kremlin just kind of let the U.S. off the hook in that particular situation and didn't pursue the matter in an attempt to avoid an escalation spiral in Syria into direct military conflict.
So on the larger subject then of U.S.-Russian relations, the subject of George Beebe's book, you mentioned earlier that was one of several realist books that are coming out. There seems to be a change in thinking, at least those are being expressed more. And then we have what Macron said at the G7, you alluded to it. He said that pushing Russia away from Europe is a profound strategic mistake. He also said that we're either pushing Russia into isolation, which increases tensions, or to ally itself with other major powers like China, which would not be in our interest. And then there was this New York Times editorial that seemed to reflect that, saying that it was time for the U.S., it was good for the U.S. basically to have good relations with Russia, and China's the real problem. Is there a change of thinking emerging that was Trump right all along? Is that what they're saying? Was right all along to say that the U.S. and Russia should have better relations? Or is this something that's just a blip in the screen, basically?
Yeah, I mean, Trump, perhaps listening to Henry Kissinger, of course, adopted this approach. Kissinger, instrumental of separating the Soviet Union from China during the Cold War. And he even said at the time, in 30 years, we'll have to do the reverse. We'll have to support Russia to divide it from China again. And here we are. And what is happening in Europe and in the US is not some greater mea culpa moment or some moment of greater foreign policy self-reflection. It's looking at the strengthening Russian, Chinese, even now Iranian strategic partnership that is on multiple levels, militarily, intelligence, economic, even cultural, scientific, becoming an alliance. If not in name, they still deny it, but in reality. And this last minute, 3 decades late, and trillions of dollars short, they can't offer anything to Russia at this point that would make Russia separate from its relationship with China, because Russia knows that the U.S. Changes from administration to administration, but this policy of pursuing hegemony, global hegemony at all costs, is not going anywhere, and that if this split did manage to happen and the West did take on China, Russia's day would come. They're well aware of that. They're not going to fall for this divide and conquer once again. This possibility of some type of strategic relationship between NATO and Russia. It existed back in the early 2000s. Putin wanted it back then, but he's learned the lesson and become the foreign policy president that Russia needed finally.
Mark Sleboda, who's isolated now? The U.S. with their sanctions, with their surrounding both Russia and China with military bases, etc., and putting enormous pressure on these countries who wound up being isolated from the world that they don't understand or think they need to understand from the other points of view. It's been a colossal failure, it looks like. It's blown back on them, and they seem to be realizing it now, that policy that they pursued against Russia in particular, it has driven those two major powers into each other's arms, and the U.S. is the one that wound up being isolated, not Russia, certainly not China. Mark, I wanted to thank you very much for joining us for a very extended interview on a number of subjects. We could have gone on each one of them in greater detail, but you've given us a lot to think about and talk about, and we appreciate you being with us on CN Live.
Thank you, and my thanks to George Beebe, too, for having a degree of bravery and realism and foreign policy thinking that most people in Washington would never admit, even in private.
Thank you again, Mark. Well, that concludes our program for tonight. Please join us next Friday for episode 10 of CN Live. Good night, Elizabeth.
Good night, Joe.
Get out your notebook. There's more.